The morning sun filtered through the faded curtains of the tiny apartment Grace and Daniel called home. It wasn't much. Just a single bedroom, a small sitting room with worn furniture, and a kitchen so narrow that only one person could stand inside comfortably. But to them it was a palace. Every corner held memories of love. The chipped dining table by the window was where they had shared countless meals, laughing over simple plates of rice and beans. The old couch had become their favorite place to sit every evening, dreaming about the future. The cracked flower pot on the balcony contained a struggling rose plant that Daniel insisted would bloom one day, just like their lives. Grace smiled as she watched her husband button his only navy blue office shirt. The collar had begun to fade, and one sleeve had been stitched twice, but Daniel wore it proudly. "You ironed it again?" Daniel asked, noticing how crisp the shirt looked. Grace nodded with a smile. "You have an interview today. My husband has to look handsome." Daniel laughed softly. "You always say that." "Because it's true." He walked over and gently kissed her forehead. "I don't know what I would do without you." Grace wrapped her arms around him. "You'll never have to find out." Daniel sighed as he picked up his worn leather folder containing copies of his certificates. "I just hope today is different." Grace looked into his eyes. "It will be. I've heard that before. This time I really believe it." Daniel smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. For nearly 3 years, he had searched endlessly for stable employment. He had graduated with excellent grades in engineering, but opportunities were scarce. Whenever companies advertised vacancies, thousands of applicants showed up. Sometimes he reached the final interview only to lose the position because someone else had connections. Other times the salary offered was barely enough to pay transportation costs. Still, he never stopped trying. "I'll call you after the interview," Daniel said. "I'll be waiting." As he stepped outside, Grace remained standing at the doorway until he disappeared around the corner. Only then did her smile fade. She quietly whispered a prayer. "Lord, please don't let him come home disappointed again." By noon, Grace was busy at her sewing machine. She worked from home, making and repairing clothes for people in the neighborhood. The machine was old and noisy, inherited from her late mother, but it had become the family's primary source of income. The room echoed with the rhythmic sound of the needle moving through fabric. She had just finished adjusting a school uniform when her phone rang. "Daniel." She answered immediately. "Hello." His voice sounded unusually calm. "The interview went well." Grace smiled. "I knew it. But..." Her smile disappeared. "They chose someone else." She closed her eyes. "I'm sorry." Daniel laughed bitterly. "It's becoming normal now." "Don't say that." "I'm tired, Grace." "You'll find something." "I've been saying that for years." There was silence between them. Finally Grace spoke gently. "Come home." "I don't feel like moving." "Come home anyway." "I don't want you to see me like this." "I always want to see you." After another moment of silence, Daniel sighed. "I'm coming." An hour later, Daniel walked through the front door looking exhausted. His shoulders drooped. His face reflected defeat. Grace didn't ask questions. She simply hugged him. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Sometimes silence comforted better than words. Finally Daniel whispered, "I'm sorry." Grace looked surprised. "For what?" "For failing you. You've never failed me. I can't even provide properly. You provide something money can't buy." Daniel looked at her. "What?" "Peace." He chuckled. "You always know what to say." Grace held both his hands. "Listen to me carefully. I married you because I loved your heart. I didn't marry your salary." Those words broke something inside Daniel. Tears filled his eyes. "I wanted to give you everything. You already have." "No. I wanted a better house. A car. A beautiful nursery for our future children." Grace smiled. "We'll get there." "How?" "One step at a time." That evening, while Daniel scrolled through job websites on his aging laptop, an email notification appeared. He almost ignored it. Then he noticed the subject line. International Recruitment Opportunity. His eyebrows narrowed. He clicked the email. As he read, his breathing slowed. Grace noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" Daniel kept reading. I don't believe this. What happened?" He turned the laptop toward her. An American engineering company had reviewed his online profile and invited him to participate in a virtual recruitment process for experienced engineers willing to relocate to the United States. The position offered an excellent salary, accommodation assistance, medical insurance, career development, and permanent residency opportunities for immediate family. Grace gasped. "Daniel, I've applied to so many international jobs. I never expected anyone to reply." She grabbed his shoulders excitedly. "You have to apply. I don't even know if they'll choose me. Apply first. What if it's a scam?" Grace carefully read every line. The company website looked genuine. The contact information appeared authentic. Everything seemed legitimate. "It looks real." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "If this works..." Grace finished his sentence. "Our lives could change forever." For the first time in months, hope filled their tiny apartment. Over the next several weeks, Daniel devoted himself entirely to the application process. He attended online interviews, completed technical assessments, submitted project portfolios, participated in engineering simulations. Grace became his greatest supporter. Every evening she helped him practice interview questions. "What would you do if a project exceeds its budget?" Daniel answered confidently. She smiled. "Perfect." Again. "What are your greatest strengths?" Again. "Tell us about a difficult engineering challenge you solved." Again. Sometimes they practiced until midnight. When Daniel doubted himself, Grace encouraged him. When he grew frustrated, she reminded him how far he had already come. One rainy evening, Daniel walked into the apartment carrying a sealed envelope. His hands trembled. Grace immediately noticed. "What happened?" "They sent this by courier." "Open it." "You open it." She laughed nervously. "No. You." Together they carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a beautifully printed letter. Daniel read the first line aloud. "Congratulations." His voice stopped. Grace stared at him. "What?" He looked up, tears already forming. "I got the job." Grace screamed. "You got it." "I got it." She jumped into his arms. They laughed. They cried. They danced around their tiny sitting room. The neighbors knocked on the wall because of the noise. Neither of them cared. For the first time since their wedding, the future finally looked bright. Their celebration lasted late into the night. They shared soft drinks and meat pies from the neighborhood bakery because it was all they could afford. Yet it felt like the grandest feast imaginable. As they ate, Daniel carefully reviewed the employment package. Then his smile slowly faded. Grace noticed immediately. "What is it?" He handed her the documents. She read quietly. Her excitement also disappeared. The company would cover part of the relocation expenses. But before reimbursement, Daniel needed to pay for his international passport renewal, visa processing, medical examinations, flight ticket, professional certification verification, and several immigration fees. The total amount was overwhelming, far beyond everything they had saved. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "I knew it was too good to be true." Grace remained silent. "I can't raise this kind of money. We'll find a way." "No." He shook his head. "I won't borrow money I can't repay." "What about the bank?" "They already rejected my loan application months ago." Grace reached for his hand. "We'll figure something out." Daniel forced a smile. "I don't want you worrying." But Grace was already thinking. She remembered the small wooden box hidden inside their wardrobe. Inside it lay the last valuable possessions left by her late mother. A gold necklace, 2 bracelets, pair of earrings, her mother's wedding ring. She had treasured them since childhood. Her mother had once said, "Keep these for difficult days." Grace quietly looked toward the bedroom. Maybe this was that difficult day. She said nothing. Not yet. The following week became a race against time. The company gave Daniel a deadline to complete all travel requirements. Every day another payment became necessary. Medical tests, document authentication, Visa fees. Daniel became increasingly discouraged. One evening Grace found him sitting alone in darkness. The lights were off. The laptop remained closed. "You didn't eat." "I'm not hungry." She sat beside him. "You've given up." "I don't have the money." Grace reached into her handbag. She gently placed a small velvet pouch into his hands. Daniel frowned. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside were her mother's jewelry pieces. Daniel immediately looked up. "No, I can't." "You have to." "Grace." She smiled softly. "My mother always told me these should build my future. They're all I have left of her. They're precious. So are you." Daniel shook his head. "I won't sell them." Grace gently closed his fingers around the pouch. "We're not selling memories. We're investing in our future." His eyes overflowed with tears. "I don't deserve you." Grace smiled through her own tears. "Then spend the rest of your life proving me wrong." Daniel pulled her into a tight embrace. "I promise you, I'll make every sacrifice worth it." Grace rested her head on his shoulder. Neither of them knew that the greatest sacrifice had not yet come. Nor did they know that within days, another life-changing surprise awaited them. One that would fill their hearts with even greater joy and make Daniel's journey away from home far more difficult than either of them could imagine. 3 weeks later, the apartment that had once echoed with laughter was filled with half-packed boxes and quiet tears. Daniel's flight to the United States was only 2 days away. The money Grace received from selling her late mother's jewelry had covered most of the travel expenses. To complete the remaining payments, she had quietly borrowed small amounts from 3 close friends and promised to repay them little by little. Daniel had no idea. As far as he knew, the jewelry had been enough. Grace wanted him to leave without carrying the burden of guilt. She believed that once he settled into his new job, everything would become easier. They would pay back every debt. They would buy another home. And perhaps someday, Daniel would buy her jewelry even more beautiful than the pieces she had sacrificed. Not because she wanted expensive things, but because it would remind them how far they had come. That evening, the couple sat together on the small balcony, watching the sun disappear behind the buildings. Daniel broke the silence. "I still don't feel right leaving you behind." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. "You aren't leaving me. I'm going ahead." He smiled. "You always know how to make bad situations sound better. Because that's exactly what's happening. I'll work hard. I know. I'll save every dollar. I know. I'll come back for you as soon as I can." Grace looked up at him. "I know." Daniel sighed deeply. "If only I could take you with me immediately." She squeezed his hand. "God's timing is always perfect." He kissed her forehead. "I'll miss you every single day." "I'll miss you too." Neither of them noticed the tears silently running down the other's face. The following morning, Grace woke up feeling strangely nauseated. She rushed to the bathroom. By the time she returned, Daniel was already waiting outside the door. "You've been sick twice this week." "I'm probably just tired." "You hardly ever get sick." Grace tried to smile. "It's nothing." Daniel studied her face. "You've also been sleeping earlier than usual. And you've been craving oranges." She laughed nervously. "So now you're a doctor?" "No. But I know my wife." Grace looked away. The thought had crossed her mind several times. Her monthly cycle was late. She had ignored it because life had become so hectic. But now, perhaps, Daniel reached into his wallet. "Let's go to the pharmacy. There are more important things to spend money on." He shook his head firmly. "Nothing is more important than your health." An hour later, they returned home carrying a small paper bag. Grace stared at the pregnancy test resting on the table. Her hands trembled. Daniel sat beside her. "Whatever the result is, we'll face it together." She smiled weakly. After a few minutes, she disappeared into the bathroom. Daniel paced around the sitting room anxiously. The silence felt endless. Finally, the bathroom door opened. Grace stepped out slowly. She held the test in shaking hands. Daniel searched her face. Neither of them spoke. Then Grace whispered, "I Her voice cracked. She burst into tears. Daniel immediately became frightened. What happened? She placed the pregnancy test into his hands. He looked down. 2 bright lines. Positive. For several seconds, Daniel simply stared. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. Grace wiped away her tears. I think we're going to be parents. Daniel looked at her again, then back at the test, then back at Grace. A huge smile spread across his face. He laughed, actually laughed, the kind of laugh that came from the deepest part of the heart. He picked Grace up and spun her around the tiny sitting room. We're having a baby. Grace laughed through her tears. Careful. He immediately stopped. Oh. He gently placed her back on the floor. I'm already acting like an irresponsible father. She smiled. I think you'll be the best father. Daniel placed both hands on her cheeks. I can't believe this. Our baby. Our little miracle. He slowly knelt before her. With trembling hands, he rested his palm on her stomach. Our little one. I know you can't hear me yet, but Daddy already loves you. Grace wiped fresh tears from her eyes. The room felt too small to contain their happiness. That evening they visited a nearby clinic. After an examination, the doctor smiled warmly. Congratulations. You're approximately 6 weeks pregnant. Grace instinctively held Daniel's hand. Daniel's eyes sparkled. Is the baby healthy? So far, everything looks good. But Grace must avoid unnecessary stress. The doctor looked directly at Daniel. She also needs proper nutrition, enough rest, and regular prenatal checkups. Daniel nodded repeatedly. I'll make sure of it. The doctor smiled knowingly. First-time fathers usually worry the most. Daniel laughed. I'm guilty. As they walked home, Daniel became unusually quiet. Grace noticed. What are you thinking? He sighed. I don't want to leave anymore. She stopped walking. What? I should stay. Grace frowned. Daniel, my child is growing inside you. You need me. I can't leave now. Grace gently took both his hands. If you stay, what happens after the baby comes? Daniel remained silent. We'll still struggle. We'll still worry about rent. We'll still wonder how to buy diapers. She placed his hand on her stomach. This baby deserves better. Daniel looked down. I know. You aren't leaving because you don't love us. You're leaving because you do. Those words settled heavily in his heart. Finally, he nodded. I'll come back quickly. You promise. I promise. 2 days later, Daniel's parents arrived from the village to see him before his journey. His mother, Beatrice, was a stern woman in her late 60s. She believed discipline solved every problem. His father, Samuel, spoke very little and usually allowed his wife to make family decisions. Daniel's younger sister, Vivian, arrived carrying several shopping bags. Grace welcomed everyone respectfully. She knelt slightly before Daniel's parents. Good afternoon, Mama. Good afternoon, Papa. Beatrice responded with only a brief nod. Grace had always sensed that her mother-in-law never completely accepted her. Beatrice had wanted Daniel to marry the daughter of one of her wealthy friends. Instead, Daniel had married Grace, a simple tailor from a humble family. Though Beatrice had never openly objected after the wedding, her disappointment lingered beneath every polite smile. During lunch, Daniel finally shared the exciting news. There's something else. Everyone looked toward him. Grace smiled nervously. Daniel reached for her hand. We're expecting a baby. For a brief moment, the room fell silent. Samuel smiled. That's wonderful. Vivian clapped excitedly. Congratulations. Only Beatrice remained expressionless. Instead of smiling, she asked, So you're already pregnant? Grace blinked. Yes, Mama. Beatrice folded her arms. And Daniel is leaving? Yes. So who will take care of you? Daniel answered immediately. I've been thinking about that. He turned toward his parents. I want Grace to stay with you until I return. Grace looked at him in surprise. Daniel smiled reassuringly. It'll only be for a few months. I'll come back once everything is settled. He looked at his mother. "Mama, please. I'll have peace of mind knowing she's with family." Beatrice hesitated. The hesitation lasted just long enough for Grace to notice. Finally, she forced a smile. "Of course. She's my daughter too." Grace smiled with relief. "Thank you, Mama." Beatrice nodded politely. Inside, however, she was already calculating the inconvenience. Another mouth to feed. Another responsibility. Another reminder that Daniel had chosen a wife she never approved of. The morning of Daniel's departure arrived far too quickly. The airport was crowded with travelers saying emotional goodbyes. Daniel hugged Grace tightly, longer than he ever had before. "I wish I didn't have to go." Grace smiled despite the tears in her eyes. "I know." He gently touched her stomach. "Take care of our baby." "I will. And yourself." "I promise. If anything happens, I'll call. If anyone mistreats you." Grace interrupted him. "No one will." Daniel looked toward his parents. His mother smiled warmly. "Don't worry about your wife. I'll take good care of her." Daniel believed every word. He hugged his mother. "Thank you." Beatrice patted his back affectionately. "Focus on your future." "I will." He hugged his father. Then Vivian. Finally, he returned to Grace. He kissed her forehead. Then her cheeks. Then her lips. "I love you. I love you more." The final boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Daniel reluctantly picked up his luggage. He turned around 3 different times before disappearing through the security checkpoint. Grace waved until she could no longer see him. Only then did the tears she had been holding back begin to fall freely. She placed one hand over her stomach. "It's just us now, little one. But Daddy will come back." Later that afternoon, Grace traveled with Daniel's family to their large ancestral home on the outskirts of the city. The compound was much bigger than the apartment she had shared with Daniel. Several relatives lived nearby, and people came and went throughout the day. Grace hoped the lively environment would help ease her loneliness. As soon as they arrived, she offered to help prepare dinner. Beatrice watched quietly. "You don't need to cook today." Grace smiled. "Thank you, Mama. You should unpack first." Grace carried her small suitcase into the guest room that had been prepared for her. It was modest but clean. She silently thanked God. Maybe living here would not be so difficult after all. That evening, Daniel called from the airport during his layover. His face appeared on the phone screen, smiling brightly. "I've landed safely." Grace smiled. "Thank God." He looked around through the video call. "How's everyone treating you?" Grace turned the camera toward the sitting room. Beatrice waved cheerfully. "We're taking very good care of her." Daniel smiled with relief. "I knew I could trust you, Mama." Grace glanced at her mother-in-law and smiled. "Everything is fine." Daniel looked lovingly at his wife. "I'll call again after I reach America. We'll be waiting." When the call ended, Grace breathed a sigh of relief. She truly believed the hardest part of their journey was over. She could not have been more wrong. As Beatrice watched the phone screen go dark, the pleasant smile slowly disappeared from her face. She looked at Grace with cold, unreadable eyes. Then she spoke in a voice completely different from the one Daniel had just heard. "Tomorrow, you will wake up at 5 o'clock." Grace blinked. 5. There is a lot of work in this house. Without another word, Beatrice turned and walked toward her bedroom. Grace stood frozen in the middle of the sitting room. A strange feeling settled in her chest. For the first time since arriving, she realized that perhaps the warm welcome she had seen through Daniel's eyes had only been an act, and she had no idea that it was only the beginning of a nightmare that would change her life forever. Grace's first morning in her in-laws' house began before the sun rose. She was startled awake by loud knocking on her bedroom door. "Grace!" The sharp voice belonged to Beatrice. Grace opened her eyes and glanced at the clock beside the bed. It was exactly 5 o'clock. Still half asleep, she hurried to open the door. Beatrice stood outside with her arms folded across her chest. "I told you to wake up at 5. I'm sorry, Mama. I was just about to get up. You should have been awake before I knocked." Grace lowered her eyes respectfully. Yes, Mama. There are buckets in the backyard. Fetch water before everyone wakes up. Grace looked outside. The sky was still dark. Now? Beatrice frowned. Did you hear me? Yes, Mama. Grace quickly wrapped a scarf around her hair and walked toward the backyard. The compound depended on a community borehole several streets away because the overhead tank had stopped working weeks earlier. She lifted 2 empty buckets and began the long walk. The cool morning air helped calm her racing thoughts. She gently placed one hand over her stomach. We're going to be okay, she whispered to the tiny life growing inside her. You and I just have to be strong. By the time Grace returned with the heavy buckets, sweat covered her face. Her back ached. She carefully set the buckets down before taking a deep breath. Before she could rest, Beatrice called again. The kitchen. Grace hurried inside. Breakfast had to be prepared before 6:30. She washed vegetables, boiled water, fried eggs, toasted bread, and made tea for the entire household. As soon as breakfast ended, there were dishes to wash, then clothes, then sweeping, then cleaning the sitting room, then washing the veranda, then preparing lunch. The work never seemed to end. By evening, Grace could barely feel her legs. Vivian walked into the kitchen carrying a plate. You missed a spot on the dining table. Grace looked up. I'm sorry. You should clean it again. Grace nodded. I will. Vivian placed the plate in the sink without another word. No, thank you. No smile. Nothing. Days turned into weeks. The routine remained the same. Wake up before dawn. Fetch water. Cook. Clean. Wash. Sweep. Iron clothes. Prepare meals. Serve everyone. Clean again. The only moments Grace truly looked forward to were Daniel's phone calls. Every evening, around 8 o'clock, her phone would ring. Daniel's smiling face appeared on the screen from his apartment in America. How are my favorite people? He would ask, placing his hand over his heart. Grace smiled every time. We're fine. And our little champion? She laughed. The baby is doing well. Daniel grinned. I already know it's a boy. Grace teased him. What if it's a girl? I'll love her just as much. He laughed. But somehow I feel it's a boy. Daniel always asked the same question before ending the call. Is everyone treating you well? Grace glanced around before answering. Yes. We're all fine. Beatrice usually made sure she was sitting nearby whenever Daniel called. She smiled sweetly whenever Daniel looked in her direction. We're taking very good care of her, she would say. Daniel never suspected anything. Why would he? The people he trusted most appeared loving and caring. Grace couldn't bring herself to tell him otherwise. He had only just started his new job. He often worked 12-hour shifts, learning unfamiliar systems and trying to prove himself. She refused to become another burden. If I tell him now, she often thought, he'll worry every day. So she remained silent. One afternoon, Grace visited the clinic for her prenatal checkup. The doctor examined her carefully. Your blood pressure is slightly low. Grace smiled weakly. I've been a little tired. The doctor looked directly at her. Are you resting enough? Grace hesitated. Not really. You need to. The pregnancy is still in its early stages. Too much physical stress isn't good. I understand. You also need proper meals. Grace nodded. I'll try. The doctor wrote a prescription for vitamins. And please avoid carrying heavy loads. Grace forced another smile. I will. But even as she said the words, she knew it would be impossible. When she returned home carrying the small paper bag of medication, Beatrice frowned. What took you so long? The doctor wanted to run a few tests. Beatrice looked at the medicine. How much did that cost? Grace quietly mentioned the amount. Beatrice clicked her tongue. So much money already. It's for the baby. The baby isn't sick. The doctor prescribed vitamins. Beatrice waved dismissively. When I had children, nobody gave me vitamins. We survived. Grace chose silence. There was no point arguing. The weeks passed, and Daniel became increasingly successful in America. His company was impressed by his work ethic. His supervisor praised his innovative ideas. He was assigned to important projects. Soon, he received his first major salary. Overjoyed, Daniel transferred a large sum of money to his mother's account. He called immediately afterward. "Mama, did you receive it?" "Yes, I did. Please use it to take good care of Grace. I want her eating healthy food. Buy fruits. Take her to the best clinic. And make sure she doesn't stress herself." Beatrice smiled into the phone. "You don't have to worry. She's like my own daughter." Daniel sighed with relief. "Thank you, Mama." After ending the call, Beatrice looked at the bank alert on her phone. Then she smiled, not with kindness, but with satisfaction. She quietly transferred a large portion of the money into her personal savings account. The remaining amount she used for household expenses. Very little was spent on Grace. That evening, dinner consisted of watery soup and a small portion of Gary. Grace noticed there was plenty of meat in everyone else's plates. She said nothing. She simply thanked God before eating. As Grace's pregnancy progressed, morning sickness became worse. Some days she struggled to stand. One particular morning, while scrubbing the bathroom floor, a wave of dizziness suddenly hit her. The room spun around her. She tried to steady herself. Instead, she collapsed onto the wet tiles. The sound attracted Vivian. She looked down at Grace lying on the floor. "What happened?" "I feel dizzy." Vivian rolled her eyes. "You've been pretending to be weak ever since you became pregnant." Grace slowly sat up. "I'm not pretending." Beatrice walked in. "What is all this?" "She fainted," Vivian said. Beatrice looked unimpressed. "If you spent less time complaining and more time working, you wouldn't be lying on the floor." Grace stared at her in disbelief. Not once did either woman ask if she or the baby was okay. She slowly stood up despite the dizziness. "I'll finish cleaning." That night, Daniel called. The moment he saw Grace's face, he frowned. "You look tired." Grace smiled. "I'm okay." "You've lost weight." "I don't think so." "You have." He studied her carefully. "Are you eating properly?" Grace hesitated for only a second. "Yes." Beatrice quickly entered the sitting room carrying a bowl of fruit. "Grace, I brought oranges for you." She placed them beside Grace with a warm smile. Daniel smiled. "Thank you, Mama. I knew you'd take care of her." Beatrice laughed softly. "Of course." After the call ended, she immediately picked up the bowl again. "These are for your father-in-law." Grace watched silently as she walked away. Not a single orange had been meant for her. A few days later, Beatrice invited several women from the neighborhood for an afternoon gathering. Grace spent the entire morning cooking. She prepared jollof rice, fried chicken, pepper soup, salads, and desserts. By the time the guests arrived, her feet were swollen. As the women admired the food, one of them smiled. "Your daughter-in-law is hard-working." Beatrice laughed loudly. "If I don't make her work, she'll become lazy." Another woman asked, "How many months pregnant is she?" "Almost 3. She should be resting." Beatrice shrugged. "Pregnancy isn't sickness." The women nodded politely. Grace continued serving drinks. No one noticed the pain hidden behind her smile. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah unexpectedly visited. Grace hadn't seen her childhood friend in months. The moment Sarah entered the compound, she gasped. "Grace!" She barely recognized her. Grace had become thinner. Her cheeks looked sunken. Dark circles surrounded her eyes. "What happened to you?" Grace forced a smile. "I'm fine." Sarah wasn't convinced. "You don't look fine." "I'm just tired." Sarah quietly observed the compound. Grace was hanging heavy clothes on the line while everyone else sat comfortably on the veranda chatting. Even Beatrice was giving instructions instead of helping. Something wasn't right. Before Sarah left, she secretly pulled Grace aside. "Tell me the truth." Grace looked toward the house. "I can't." "You can." "I don't want Daniel to worry." Sarah sighed. "Grace, if things get worse, my door is always open." Grace hugged her tightly. "Thank you." She hoped she would never need that offer. The very next week, disaster struck. Beatrice burst into the sitting room holding an envelope. Her face burned with anger. "Who entered my room?" Everyone looked up. "I don't know," Vivian answered. Beatrice opened the envelope dramatically. "The money is gone." Grace frowned. "What money?" "The cash your husband sent." The room became silent. Beatrice slowly turned toward Grace. "You were cleaning my room yesterday." "Yes." "Where is my money?" Grace blinked in shock. "Mama, I don't know." "Liar. I didn't take anything." Vivian immediately joined in. "You're the only one who entered her room." Grace looked from one face to another. "I was only sweeping." "So the money disappeared by itself?" Beatrice snapped. "I don't know what happened." Beatrice stepped closer. "Return my money now." Grace felt her heart pounding. "I swear, I didn't touch it." Beatrice laughed bitterly. "You think because my son is abroad you can steal from us?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I would never do that." The shouting attracted neighbors, who began gathering outside the compound. Within minutes, Daniel's older brothers also arrived. They listened as Beatrice repeated her accusation. Without asking a single question, one of them turned to Grace. "Pack your things." Grace stared at him. "What?" "You heard me. I didn't steal anything. We don't want a thief in this house." She burst into tears. "Please, believe me. I have nowhere to go." Another brother walked toward her room. He returned carrying her small suitcase. He threw it onto the ground. Grace rushed after him. "I'm pregnant. Please, at least let me call Daniel." Beatrice folded her arms. "My son has enough problems. We won't disturb him with your disgrace." Grace fell to her knees. "I beg you. I've done nothing wrong." No one listened. One brother grabbed her suitcase. Another held the front gate open. Beatrice pointed toward the road. "Leave." Grace clutched her stomach protectively. "My baby. Leave before I call the police." Tears streamed down her face as she slowly picked up her suitcase. She took one last look at the house where she had hoped to find family. Instead, she had found betrayal. The gate slammed shut behind her with a loud metallic crash. Grace stood alone on the dusty roadside beneath the scorching afternoon sun. Homeless, heartbroken, pregnant, and abandoned by the very people her husband had trusted with her life. She didn't know where to go. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. All she knew was that she had to protect the tiny heartbeat growing inside her, even if she had to face the rest of the world completely alone. Grace stood motionless on the dusty roadside, her small suitcase resting beside her. The heavy iron gate that had just been slammed in her face seemed to echo in her ears long after the sound had faded. She stared at the gate, hoping, praying, that someone would open it. Perhaps Daniel's father would come outside. Perhaps one of his brothers would realize they had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps Beatrice would remember that she was carrying her grandchild. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nothing happened. No one came. No one even looked outside. Grace slowly wiped away the tears that blurred her vision. She placed one trembling hand over her stomach. "It's okay," she whispered to the baby growing inside her. "I'm here." Her voice cracked. "I won't let anything happen to you." But deep inside, she had no idea how she was going to keep that promise. She had less than 2,000 naira in her handbag. Her phone battery was nearly dead. She had nowhere to sleep. And she was pregnant. The afternoon sun grew hotter with every passing minute. Grace picked up her suitcase and began walking without a destination. She didn't want curious neighbors asking questions. Every step felt heavier than the last. Her feet were swollen from weeks of hard labor at her in-laws' house, and now they had to carry her through an uncertain future. Cars drove past without slowing down. People hurried about their own lives. No one noticed the pregnant woman walking alone with tears rolling down her cheeks. After nearly an hour, Grace reached a small public park. She sat on an old wooden bench beneath a mango tree. The cool shade offered a little relief. Her stomach growled. She realized she had not eaten since early morning. She opened her handbag. Inside was a bottle of water and 2 dry biscuits she had forgotten were there. She ate them slowly, taking tiny bites. "There for you too," she said softly to her unborn baby. "I wish I could give you something better." The words made fresh tears spill onto her cheeks. Her phone vibrated. For one hopeful second, she thought it might be Daniel. Instead, it was Sarah, her childhood friend. Grace hesitated before answering. She didn't want Sarah to hear her crying. The phone rang again, and again. Finally, Grace answered. "Hello." Sarah immediately sensed something was wrong. "Grace." There was silence. "Grace, are you crying?" Grace covered her mouth, trying to stop the sobs. It was no use. The pain she had held inside for weeks burst out all at once. Sarah's voice became urgent. "Talk to me. What happened?" "They." Grace struggled to breathe. "They threw me out." Sarah froze. "Who?" "My husband's family." Sarah stood up from the salon chair where she had been braiding a customer's hair. "What?" "They said I stole money." "I didn't. I swear I didn't." "I know you didn't. Where are you?" Grace looked around the unfamiliar park. I don't even know." "Look around. There is a fountain. And a small church across the road." "I know where that is." "Don't move. I'm coming." Less than 30 minutes later, Sarah's old taxi stopped near the park. The moment she saw Grace sitting alone with her suitcase, her heart broke. Grace looked nothing like the cheerful friend she had known since childhood. Her face was pale. Her clothes were dusty. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Sarah rushed toward her. Without saying a word, she wrapped her arms around Grace. Grace broke down completely. She cried against Sarah's shoulder like a little child. "I don't know what I did wrong." "You did nothing. They hate me." Sarah gently rubbed her back. "I know. I tried so hard to please them. I know. I kept thinking things would get better." Sarah pulled away just enough to look into Grace's face. "You're coming home with me." Grace shook her head. "I don't want to be a burden." "You could never be a burden. My apartment is small. But we'll make room." Grace hesitated. "I can't even pay rent." Sarah smiled. "Did I ask you for rent?" "No." "Then stop arguing." Grace hugged her again. "Thank you." Sarah smiled through her own tears. Friends don't abandon each other. Sarah lived in a tiny one-room apartment above a roadside salon. The room was simple. One narrow bed stood against the wall. A small gas cooker occupied one corner. A wooden wardrobe leaned slightly because one of its legs was broken. A single ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. "This is home," Sarah said with an apologetic smile. Grace looked around. To anyone else, the room might have seemed cramped. To her, it felt like the safest place in the world. "It's beautiful," Sarah laughed. "You don't have to pretend." "I'm not pretending. It's peaceful." Sarah placed Grace's suitcase near the wardrobe. "You'll sleep on the bed." "What about you?" "I'll sleep on the mattress." "No. We'll share." Sarah smiled, still as stubborn as ever. That evening, Sarah cooked rice with vegetable stew. Grace noticed there were only 2 pieces of meat. Sarah quietly placed both on Grace's plate. Grace frowned. "What about yours?" "I'm not hungry." Grace immediately divided 1 piece onto Sarah's plate. "Neither of us is eating alone." Sarah smiled. "I've missed you." "I've missed you too." For the first time in weeks, Grace laughed. It wasn't a long laugh, but it was enough to remind her that hope still existed. The following morning, Grace woke up determined not to depend entirely on Sarah. After breakfast, she sat beside her friend. "I need work." Sarah looked at her. "You're pregnant." "I know. You should rest." "I also need to eat." Sarah sighed. "You have a point." She thought for a moment. "The restaurant across the street sometimes needs people to wash dishes." Grace nodded immediately. "I'll go. They don't pay much. Anything helps. They're also strict. I've survived worse." Sarah wished those words weren't true. Grace got the job that same afternoon. The restaurant owner, a middle-aged woman named Madame Rose, looked her over carefully. You're pregnant. Yes. Can you work? I can. The work isn't easy. I'll do my best. Madame Rose nodded. I'll pay you daily. The money isn't much. Grace smiled gratefully. Thank you. Her duties began immediately. She washed plates, cleaned tables, swept the floor, mopped the kitchen, disposed of garbage. Sometimes she stood for hours without sitting. By closing time, every part of her body ached. Madame Rose handed her the day's wages. Grace stared at the money in disbelief. It wasn't much, but it was the first money she had earned since leaving Daniel's family. She held it tightly. I earned this honestly. That night, she bought fruits before returning home. Sarah smiled when she saw them. You didn't have to. I wanted to. And these are for the baby. Life settled into a difficult routine. Every morning Grace worked at the restaurant. Some afternoons she helped Sarah braid customers' hair. In the evenings she returned to the restaurant for the dinner rush. On weekends she accepted extra work washing clothes for families in nearby neighborhoods. Whenever someone needed a cleaner, she volunteered. Whenever someone wanted clothes ironed, she accepted. She never complained. She simply kept working. Each night, before falling asleep, she carefully counted every naira she had earned. Some went toward food, some toward transportation, some toward prenatal vitamins. She saved whatever little remained. One evening Sarah noticed Grace placing 50 naira into a small tin container. What are you saving for? Grace smiled. The baby's future. Sarah shook her head in admiration. You've been through so much, and you're still thinking about tomorrow. Grace gently rubbed her stomach. I have to. I'm someone's mother now. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in America, Daniel's life was changing faster than he had ever imagined. His intelligence quickly caught the attention of senior executives. He solved engineering problems that had delayed major projects for months. He developed innovative ideas that saved the company millions of dollars. During one board meeting, the company's chief executive smiled. Daniel, you've exceeded every expectation. We're promoting you. Daniel blinked. So soon. You earned it. Along with the promotion came a significant salary increase, a housing allowance, company shares, and performance bonuses. Daniel could hardly believe it. That evening he called his mother. Mama, I have good news. What is it? I've been promoted. Beatrice smiled broadly. Congratulations, my son. I want to send more money. Please make sure Grace is comfortable. I don't want her worrying about anything. Don't worry. We're taking excellent care of her. Daniel smiled with relief. Thank you. I'll come home very soon. We'll be waiting. After ending the call, Beatrice quietly laughed to herself. The foolish boy believes everything. She never once mentioned that Grace had already been gone for weeks. Back in Nigeria, Grace's pregnancy became more noticeable. One afternoon, while carrying a bucket of water behind the restaurant, she suddenly stopped. A sharp pain shot through her lower back. She leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Madame Rose noticed immediately. Grace. She hurried over. Sit down. I'm fine. No. Sit. Grace slowly lowered herself onto a wooden stool. Madame Rose handed her a bottle of water. You need to be careful. I know. You're working too hard. Grace smiled weakly. If I don't work, my baby won't eat. Madame Rose looked at the young woman with compassion. You remind me of myself. My husband died when I was expecting our second child. Grace looked surprised. I had to work through my pregnancy too. She placed a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. But listen to me. No amount of money is worth losing your child. Grace nodded. I understand. From that day on, Madame Rose quietly reduced Grace's workload whenever she could. Sometimes she even packed leftover food for her to take home. Grace never forgot such kindness. Every night, before sleeping, Grace took out the framed wedding photograph she had managed to save before leaving her in-laws' house. She gently wiped away the dust. In the picture, Daniel smiled at her with eyes full of love. She traced his face with her fingers. "I miss you." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I wish you knew the truth." She imagined him working hard in America. She imagined him dreaming about bringing his wife and baby to join him. If only he knew where they really were. She wanted to call him countless times, to tell him everything, to cry in his arms. But each time she reached for her phone, she stopped herself. What if he leaves his job? What if he comes back before securing our future? I can't destroy everything we sacrificed for. So she stayed silent. She chose suffering over becoming a distraction. Little did Grace know that her silence was creating the perfect opportunity for lies to grow. The distance between husband and wife was no longer measured in thousands of miles. It was being filled with deception, manipulation, and betrayal. And soon, those lies would convince Daniel that the woman he loved had abandoned him forever. 5 months passed faster than Daniel had imagined. When he first arrived in the United States, every day had felt like a battle. There were new systems to learn, unfamiliar accents to understand, endless meetings, and the pressure of proving that the company had made the right decision by hiring a young engineer from Nigeria. Now, those difficult days seemed far behind him. His hard work had earned him the respect of everyone around him. The promotion he had received after only a few months had shocked even his supervisors. His investment in the company's stock had grown rapidly, and a generous performance bonus had allowed him to invest in a small technology startup that unexpectedly became successful. Newspapers began referring to him as one of the fastest-rising young entrepreneurs in the engineering and technology industry. Daniel hardly paid attention to the headlines. His thoughts were always somewhere else. Home. Every morning before leaving for work, he looked at the framed wedding photograph on his bedside table. Grace's smiling face greeted him every day. He would gently touch the frame. "Just a little longer," he would whisper. "I'm coming for you." He had already begun making plans. He had rented a beautiful 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. One room had already been painted in soft cream colors. Although he did not yet know whether the baby was a boy or a girl, he had started decorating a nursery. A small white crib stood near the window. Tiny stuffed animals sat neatly on a shelf. There was even a rocking chair where he imagined Grace feeding their baby while he read bedtime stories. His colleagues laughed whenever they walked past the nursery. "You haven't even met the baby yet," one of them joked. Daniel smiled proudly. "I'm making up for lost time." He refused to let Grace or their child lack anything. Every sacrifice, every late night at work, every hour of overtime had one purpose: his family. 2 weeks before his planned trip home, Daniel entered one of the largest shopping malls in the city. He carried a list inside his pocket. Grace's gifts came first. He bought elegant maternity dresses made from soft fabric, comfortable shoes recommended for pregnant women, a delicate gold necklace with a tiny heart-shaped pendant, a bracelet engraved with the words "Forever Together." He imagined fastening it around Grace's wrist himself. Then he moved to the baby section. For nearly an hour, he wandered through rows of tiny clothes. He laughed to himself while holding up miniature socks no bigger than his palm. "Can babies really be this small?" he asked a saleswoman. She smiled. "They grow faster than you expect." Daniel purchased baby blankets, bottles, diapers, blankets decorated with little stars, toys, and even a teddy bear almost as large as the shopping cart. Finally, he visited a jewelry store. He stared at a sparkling diamond wedding band. The sales assistant approached him. "Looking for something special?" Daniel smiled. "My wife sold her mother's jewelry to help me come here." The woman listened quietly. "I promised myself that one day I'd replace every piece she lost." He pointed at the ring. "I'll start with this." As the ring was carefully packaged, Daniel felt an overwhelming excitement. Soon he would see Grace again. Soon he would hold her. Soon he would finally place his hand on her growing belly instead of talking to their baby through a phone screen. The evening before his flight, Daniel could barely sleep. He kept checking his luggage to make sure he had packed everything. Passport, documents, baby gifts, Grace's jewelry, chocolate, perfume, designer handbags. Everything was ready. At dawn he called Grace. The call did not connect. He frowned. He tried again. Still nothing. Maybe the network is bad, he thought. He sent a message. I'm finally coming home. I can't wait to see you. I love you. The message remained undelivered. He frowned but didn't panic. Poor network coverage happened often. He boarded the plane with a heart full of excitement. Nearly 20 hours later, Daniel stepped out of the airport in Lagos. The warm Nigerian air greeted him like an old friend. He smiled. I'm home. A driver hired by his company loaded the luggage into a luxury SUV. Where to, sir? Daniel smiled. My parents' house. As the vehicle drove through familiar streets, memories flooded his mind. There was the roadside food stall where Grace loved buying roasted corn. The church where they had prayed before his visa interview. The small park where they had spent their first wedding anniversary. Everything reminded him of her. He couldn't stop smiling. When the SUV pulled into his parents' compound, everyone rushed outside. Beatrice screamed with excitement. My son! She embraced him tightly. Samuel shook his hand proudly. Vivian jumped up and down. You've changed. Daniel laughed. I've just gained a little weight. He greeted everyone warmly before looking around. His smile remained, but his eyes searched the compound. Where's Grace? The laughter suddenly disappeared. No one answered. Daniel looked from one face to another. Mama! Beatrice forced a weak smile. Come inside first. Daniel frowned. Where's my wife? Samuel cleared his throat. We'll explain. A strange uneasiness settled in Daniel's chest. Inside the sitting room, Daniel placed the gift bags on the table. I bought things for Grace. And the baby. Again, no one spoke. Finally, Beatrice sighed dramatically. My son. You have to be strong. Daniel stared at her. What happened? She lowered her head as though the words were painful to say. Grace is no longer here. Daniel blinked. What do you mean? She left. His smile faded. Left where? Vivian spoke quietly. She moved out. Daniel laughed nervously. I told her to stay here. Why would she leave? No one answered immediately. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. Mama! What happened? Beatrice slowly looked into his eyes. She met another man. Daniel froze. What? She said she couldn't continue waiting. His face went completely blank. No. Samuel sighed deeply. We tried to stop her. She refused. Daniel shook his head repeatedly. No. That's impossible. Vivian quickly joined the story. She started receiving phone calls from another man. We noticed the changes. Daniel looked at her in disbelief. What are you saying? She eventually packed her things and left. Beatrice reached for his hand. I'm sorry. She even said. She paused deliberately. What? She said she deserved a better life. Daniel pulled his hand away. No. My Grace would never say that. Beatrice wiped imaginary tears from her eyes. We didn't want to tell you while you were working. You were building your future. We didn't want to distract you. Daniel stood up. I don't believe this. You don't have to. Samuel spoke quietly. But it's the truth. Daniel grabbed his phone. I'm calling her. He dialed Grace's number. The call failed. He tried again. The phone was switched off. Again. Switched off. His breathing became uneven. He opened his messages. The last message he had sent before leaving America was still undelivered. His chest tightened. She wouldn't. Beatrice spoke softly. She changed her number. Daniel looked at her sharply. How do you know? She told us. He refused to accept it. No. I'm going to find her. For the next 3 days, Daniel searched everywhere. He visited the apartment where he and Grace had lived after their wedding. The landlord recognized him immediately. Daniel, you're back. Yes. I'm looking for Grace. The elderly landlord sighed. She moved out months ago. Do you know where she went? He shook his head. No. Daniel visited their church. No one had seen her. He checked the tailoring shop where Grace used to work. The owner shrugged. She stopped coming. He visited old neighbors. Some had moved away. Others genuinely knew nothing. Every dead end made his heart heavier. At night, he sat alone inside his hotel room staring at Grace's photograph. He replayed every memory, every conversation, every promise. Nothing matched the accusations his family had made. Still, why couldn't he find her? Why had she disappeared completely? Questions tormented him without answers. Meanwhile, across town, Grace was working another exhausting shift at Madame Rose's restaurant. Her pregnancy was now clearly visible beneath her uniform. She carefully balanced a tray of food as customers filled the dining area. She had no idea that the man she loved had returned to Nigeria. She had no idea he was desperately searching for her. Her phone had stopped working weeks earlier after falling into a bucket of water while she cleaned tables. Replacing it had become impossible. Every naira she earned went toward food, rent, transportation, and prenatal care. Sometimes she wondered whether Daniel had tried calling. Then she pushed the thought away. "He'll come soon," she whispered. "I just have to hold on." On the fourth day, Daniel returned to his parents' house exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. His beard had begun to grow. For the first time since arriving, he looked defeated. Beatrice placed a cup of tea before him. "You need to let her go." Daniel stared silently at the cup. "I can't." "You must." She made her choice. Daniel slowly shook his head. "My heart says something isn't right." Vivian sighed dramatically. "Brother, some women change. Money changes people." Daniel looked up angrily. "Grace isn't some women." The room fell silent. He stood and walked toward the window. "I know my wife." "Then why can't you find her?" Samuel asked quietly. The question hit Daniel like a hammer. Why couldn't he? He had searched everywhere he could think of. There was no trace, no phone, no address, nothing. His confidence slowly began to crumble. Weeks passed. Daniel remained in Nigeria longer than planned. Every day he continued searching. Every day ended in disappointment. Eventually, his company demanded that he return to America. Several important projects required his leadership. With a broken heart, Daniel boarded another flight. As the plane lifted into the clouds, he stared out the window. For the first time in his life, he felt completely helpless. The woman who had believed in him when he had nothing, the woman who had sold her mother's precious jewelry so he could chase his dreams, the woman carrying his first child, had vanished without a trace. Or so he believed. Back in America, Daniel buried himself in work. His success reached heights he had never imagined. His investments multiplied. Business magazines began calling him a billionaire before his 35th birthday. He purchased companies, expanded into real estate, spoke at international conferences. The world admired the wealthy entrepreneur whose brilliant mind seemed capable of solving any problem. But behind every award, every headline, and every business victory was a lonely man carrying a broken heart. He never removed his wedding ring. He never stopped loving Grace. Yet the lies repeated by his family echoed louder with every passing month. Slowly, painfully, he began convincing himself that perhaps the impossible had happened. Perhaps the woman he loved had truly chosen another life. And when powerful business associates later introduced him to the elegant daughter of a wealthy investor named Vanessa, Daniel would make the most difficult and most heartbreaking decision of his life, believing there was nothing left to hold on to. Nearly a year had passed since Daniel returned to America with more questions than answers. From the outside, his life looked perfect. He was now one of the youngest billionaires in the technology and engineering industry. His companies employed thousands of people across different countries. Business magazines featured him on their covers, calling him the African genius who conquered Silicon Valley. His calendar was always full. Board meetings, investment conferences, international interviews, charity galas, networking dinners, business acquisitions. Success followed him wherever he went. But every night, when the meetings ended and the cameras disappeared, Daniel returned to a house that felt painfully empty. The nursery he had prepared months earlier remained untouched. The white crib stood exactly where he had placed it. Tiny baby clothes still hung neatly inside the wardrobe. The rocking chair by the window had never been used. Sometimes Daniel walked into the room, sat quietly in the rocking chair, and imagined what could have been. He pictured Grace humming lullabies while holding their baby. He imagined himself changing diapers, making funny faces to stop the baby from crying, and laughing as tiny feet kicked happily in the air. Instead, the room was silent. He often wondered if his child had even been born. If Grace had truly remarried, had another man held his baby first? The thought shattered him every single time. One rainy evening, Daniel stood before the large window of his penthouse apartment, staring at the lights of the city below. His assistant, Mark, knocked gently on the office door. "Sir." Daniel didn't turn around. "What is it?" "You've canceled dinner again." "I'm not hungry." Mark sighed. "You've barely eaten today." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Daniel finally looked at him. "I appreciate your concern, but I'd rather be alone." Mark hesitated before speaking. "If I may say something." Daniel nodded. "You've spent almost a year looking for someone who doesn't want to be found." Those words stung. Daniel looked away. "I know. You deserve to be happy too." Daniel gave a weak smile. "I used to think I was." Mark quietly left the office. The silence returned. Daniel opened the drawer of his desk. Inside was the small ultrasound appointment card Grace had once shown him before he left Nigeria. He had carried it everywhere. It was beginning to fade from being handled so often. He gently traced Grace's handwriting on the back. "Come home soon. Your baby already loves you." He closed his eyes. "I tried." A few weeks later, Daniel attended an international business conference in New York. The event brought together some of the world's biggest investors and entrepreneurs. During a networking dinner, Daniel was introduced to Victor Harrison, a respected billionaire and owner of one of America's largest investment firms. Victor was impressed by Daniel almost immediately. "I've heard a lot about you." Daniel smiled politely. "I hope only good things." Victor laughed. "Very good things." The two men talked for over an hour about technology, infrastructure, renewable energy, and international investments. By the end of the evening, Victor extended his hand. "I think we should work together." Daniel shook it. "I'd like that." The partnership quickly proved successful. Within months, their companies collaborated on several major projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Victor admired Daniel's honesty. Unlike many wealthy businessmen he had encountered, Daniel valued integrity more than profit. One evening after a board meeting, Victor invited Daniel to dinner at his mansion. "There is someone I'd like you to meet." Daniel assumed it was another investor. He agreed without much thought. Victor's mansion overlooked a beautiful lake. The elegant home reflected years of wealth and careful taste. As Daniel entered the dining room, Victor smiled warmly. "Daniel, meet my daughter." A graceful young woman stood up from her chair. She wore a simple navy blue dress and smiled politely. "I'm Vanessa. It's nice to finally meet you." Daniel shook her hand. "The pleasure is mine." Vanessa was intelligent, well-spoken, and surprisingly humble despite growing up in luxury. Throughout dinner, she asked thoughtful questions about Daniel's childhood, his education, and his journey to success. Unlike many people who focused only on his wealth, she seemed genuinely interested in who he was. When dinner ended, Victor walked Daniel to the entrance. "My daughter likes you." Daniel smiled awkwardly. "She's a wonderful person." Victor looked directly at him. "I know about your past." Daniel's smile disappeared. "I also know life doesn't always go according to plan." Daniel nodded quietly. "No, it doesn't." Over the following months, Victor frequently invited Daniel to family gatherings. At first, Daniel accepted only because of business. Gradually, he became friends with Vanessa. She never pressured him, never flirted aggressively, never asked about his money. She simply enjoyed talking to him. One afternoon they sat in a quiet cafe overlooking Central Park. Vanessa stirred her coffee slowly. "You still love your wife?" Daniel looked surprised. Is it that obvious? She smiled sadly. You wear your wedding ring. You never remove it. Daniel looked down at the ring. I forgot it was even there. No, I don't think you forgot. He sighed deeply. I searched everywhere. I couldn't find her. Vanessa remained silent. I still don't understand why she left. What if she didn't? Daniel looked up. My family wouldn't lie to me. Vanessa studied his face. People sometimes do terrible things. Daniel shook his head. Not my parents. Though even as he spoke those words, a small part of him remembered the strange uneasiness he had felt when he first heard their story. Still, he had no evidence. Only questions. Meanwhile, back in Nigeria, Grace's pregnancy had entered its final months. Her baby bump had become impossible to hide beneath the restaurant uniform. Madame Rose had insisted she stop carrying heavy trays. Instead, Grace greeted customers, cleaned tables, and handled lighter duties. Business was slow that afternoon. Sarah visited the restaurant carrying a bag of fresh fruit. You've been working again. Grace smiled. We need money. Sarah sat beside her. You also need rest. Grace gently rubbed her stomach. The baby has been kicking all morning. Sarah laughed. He already knows his mother works too hard. Grace smiled. I can't wait to meet him. You think it's a boy too? I don't know. But Daniel always believed it would be. The mention of his name brought silence. Sarah reached across the table. Have you heard anything? Grace shook her head. No. You should try contacting him. I don't even have a phone anymore. Sarah sighed. I wish he knew. Grace looked down. So do I. Back in America, Daniel's loneliness continued to grow. His work filled his schedule but never his heart. One evening, Victor invited him into his study. I want to ask you something. Daniel nodded. Go ahead. Victor leaned forward. I won't force you. But have you ever considered starting over? Daniel smiled faintly. I've tried not to think about it. My daughter cares deeply for you. Daniel remained silent. I've never seen her this interested in anyone. Victor continued gently. Life sometimes closes one chapter, so another can begin. Daniel stared at the floor. Could he really move on? Did Grace truly belong to someone else now? Had she built a new family? Was he the only one still trapped in the past? That night he barely slept. He walked into the unused nursery once again. The room seemed frozen in time. He picked up the tiny teddy bear he had bought months earlier. I don't know what else to do, he whispered. I waited. I searched. I prayed. But maybe. He couldn't finish the sentence. Maybe it was finally time to let go. Several weeks later, Daniel flew to Nigeria for another unsuccessful search. This time he hired private investigators. They searched public records, visited hospitals, checked voter registrations, looked through employment records. Nothing. It was as if Grace had disappeared from the face of the earth. The investigators eventually delivered their report. We're sorry. We couldn't locate her. Daniel closed the file. For the first time since returning to Nigeria months earlier, he allowed himself to believe what he had fought against for so long. Maybe his family had been telling the truth. Maybe Grace truly didn't want to be found. His heart refused to believe it, but his mind had become exhausted. Months later, Victor invited Daniel to another dinner. After the meal, Vanessa walked with him through the garden. The evening breeze carried the scent of blooming roses. I heard you went back to Nigeria. Daniel nodded. I found nothing. I'm sorry. So am I. They walked in silence. Finally, Vanessa stopped. I need to ask you something. Daniel looked at her. If the past is truly gone, would you ever consider building a future with someone else? Daniel closed his eyes briefly. His answer did not come easily. I don't know if I can love again. Vanessa smiled gently. I'm not asking you to answer today. She walked away, giving him space. Weeks turned into months. Victor never pressured Daniel. Neither did Vanessa. Instead, they offered friendship, patience, and understanding. Slowly, Daniel began spending more time with them. He smiled more often. He laughed occasionally. The pain remained, but it no longer consumed every waking moment. One afternoon, after speaking with his pastor and several close friends, Daniel made a decision that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. He visited Victor's office. "I've thought about everything." Victor looked up. "And?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I can't keep living in yesterday." Victor remained silent. "I searched for Grace. I did everything I could. If she truly has another life now, then holding on won't change anything." Victor nodded respectfully. Daniel swallowed hard. "If Vanessa is still willing, I'd like to get to know her with the intention of marriage." Victor smiled warmly. "I believe you'll make each other very happy." Daniel forced a smile, but inside, something still hurt. Months later, after a respectful courtship, Daniel proposed to Vanessa. She accepted with tears of joy. Preparations for one of the year's biggest society weddings immediately began. Luxury hotels were booked. International guests confirmed their attendance. Celebrities, politicians, and business leaders received elegant invitations. The media called it the wedding of the decade. Everyone celebrated the union between two billionaire families. Everyone except Daniel. He smiled for photographs. He attended planning meetings. He chose suits and venues. Yet every time he looked into the mirror, he saw a man trying to convince himself that he had finally moved on. He had no idea that, thousands of miles away in Nigeria, the woman he had never stopped loving was still wearing the wedding ring he had placed on her finger. Nor did he know that fate was already arranging a meeting neither of them could have imagined. On the very day he was supposed to marry another woman, one unexpected face in the crowd would expose every lie his family had told, and change all of their lives forever. The grand ballroom of the Royal Crest International Hotel glittered beneath magnificent crystal chandeliers. Every corner reflected wealth and elegance. Fresh white roses lined the entrance, while thousands of tiny golden lights transformed the reception hall into what looked like a fairy tale. Outside, luxury cars stretched across the parking lot. Television reporters waited near the entrance. Photographers hurried from one celebrity to another. Politicians, governors, business tycoons, foreign investors, movie stars, and international dignitaries had gathered to witness what newspapers had already named the wedding of the year. The marriage between billionaire entrepreneur Daniel Okafor and American business heiress Vanessa Harrison had become the biggest social event of the year. Inside the bridal suite, Vanessa stood before a large mirror while two makeup artists made final adjustments to her gown. She looked breathtaking. Yet instead of excitement, she noticed something else every time Daniel's name was mentioned: concern. Earlier that morning, when she had called him, his voice had sounded distant. Not nervous, not excited, just empty. Her maid of honor noticed the expression on her face. "You're thinking about him again." Vanessa smiled faintly. "I've never seen a groom so quiet." "He loves you." Vanessa looked at her own reflection. "I know he respects me. But love..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Deep inside, she knew there was still a part of Daniel's heart that belonged to another woman. She had hoped time would heal those wounds. Today she prayed she was right. Meanwhile, on the other side of the hotel, Daniel stood alone in a private lounge overlooking the gardens. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. Everything about him reflected success. His expensive watch, his polished shoes, his confident posture. He looked every inch the billionaire the world admired. Yet his expression betrayed none of the joy expected from a man about to be married. His best man, Michael, adjusted his tie before speaking. "You look like you're about to attend a board meeting." Daniel forced a smile. "I'm just thinking." "You've been thinking all morning." Michael walked closer. "Are you sure about this?" Daniel looked out the window. "I don't know." "That's not the answer I expected." Daniel sighed deeply. "I searched for Grace. I waited. I prayed. I hired investigators. I went back to Nigeria more than once. I found nothing." Michael nodded quietly. "I know. I can't spend the rest of my life chasing someone who disappeared." Michael hesitated. But, Daniel smiled sadly. But every time I close my eyes, I still see her. Silence filled the room. Finally, Michael placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Whatever happens today, I just want you to find peace. Daniel nodded. So do I. Several floors below, dozens of hotel employees rushed around preparing for the reception. The catering company had hired extra temporary staff because of the enormous number of guests. Among them was Grace. Life had changed dramatically since she had been thrown out of Daniel's family home. Her pregnancy had progressed safely despite countless hardships. A few months earlier, she had given birth to a healthy baby boy. Sarah had stood beside her throughout the delivery. Madame Rose had helped pay part of the hospital bill. Grace had named her son David. Every time she looked at him, she saw Daniel's eyes, his smile, his dimples, his calm nature. David was now 4 months old. Because she could not afford a nanny, Sarah stayed home with the baby whenever Grace accepted temporary jobs. Today was one of those days. The catering supervisor handed uniforms to the waitresses. Everyone listened carefully. This is a very important event. No mistakes. Grace accepted her neatly pressed white shirt, black skirt, and apron. She tied her hair into a neat bun. Another waitress smiled at her. You've done weddings before? Grace nodded. A few. This one is huge. Grace smiled politely. I noticed. She had no idea whose wedding it was. She rarely followed celebrity news. Most of her energy went into caring for David and working enough hours to buy milk, diapers, and food. To her, today was simply another job. Another opportunity to earn enough money to support her son. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Guests applauded as Daniel and Vanessa exchanged vows. Daniel spoke every word respectfully. Vanessa smiled warmly. Yet several people noticed something unusual. Although Daniel never hesitated, his smile never reached his eyes. He looked grateful, respectful, kind, but not deeply in love. Only Michael noticed him glance toward the empty seats near the back of the hall several times, almost as though he were still expecting someone impossible to appear. The reception began with laughter, music, and celebration. A live orchestra played softly while guests enjoyed expensive meals prepared by some of the country's finest chefs. Grace and the other waitresses moved quietly between the tables serving drinks and appetizers. She focused entirely on her work. Smile, serve, collect empty plates, move to the next table. Her feet already hurt, but she ignored the pain. David needed formula. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Every tray she carried reminded her why she couldn't afford mistakes. Daniel greeted one business associate after another. Congratulations echoed endlessly. Beautiful wedding. You deserve every happiness. What an incredible celebration. Daniel thanked everyone politely. Inside, however, he felt strangely disconnected. He couldn't explain it. An uncomfortable feeling had settled in his chest since morning, almost as though something important had been forgotten. Vanessa noticed. You've barely eaten. I'm fine. You've said that 5 times today. Daniel smiled apologetically. I guess I'm just tired. Before she could respond, another group of guests approached. Grace carefully balanced a silver tray filled with champagne glasses. The ballroom was becoming crowded. People laughed loudly. Music grew livelier. She carefully stepped around photographers taking pictures near the dance floor. Suddenly someone bumped into her shoulder. She lost her balance. The tray tilted. Several glasses crashed onto the polished marble floor. The loud shattering sound silenced nearby conversations. Grace immediately dropped to her knees. I'm so sorry. I'll clean it. The catering supervisor hurried over. What happened? I'm sorry. It was an accident. Guests stepped back to avoid the broken glass. Daniel instinctively turned toward the noise. At first, he saw only a waitress kneeling on the floor. Then, she lifted her face. Time stopped. His heart slammed against his chest. His breathing disappeared. No, couldn't be. The tray slipped from Grace's trembling hands completely. She looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. Daniel whispered so softly that only he could hear it. "Grace." The color drained from his face. The room around him faded. The music disappeared. The voices disappeared. Everything disappeared except the woman kneeling before him. She looked thinner than he remembered. Her cheeks had lost their youthful fullness. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes. Yet he would have recognized her anywhere. Grace, his wife, alive, standing only a few meters away. Grace stared back in complete disbelief. Her lips trembled. She blinked several times. Maybe she was imagining him. Maybe exhaustion had finally caught up with her. But no, it was Daniel, wearing a groom's tuxedo, standing beside another woman. Her heart shattered. For months she had dreamed about seeing him again. She had imagined running into his arms. Instead, she had found him marrying someone else. Tears instantly filled her eyes. Guests looked back and forth between them, confused. Neither Daniel nor Grace seemed aware that hundreds of people were watching. Daniel slowly walked toward her. One step, then another. His voice shook. "Grace!" She lowered her eyes, unable to bear the sight of him. The catering supervisor whispered urgently, "Stand up." Grace couldn't move. Daniel reached her. He knelt in front of her without caring that his expensive tuxedo touched the floor. The ballroom erupted into murmurs. "Do they know each other? Who is she? What is happening?" Daniel's hands trembled. He reached toward Grace's face, then stopped halfway, afraid she might disappear if he touched her. His voice cracked. "It's really you." Grace finally looked at him. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "Hello, Daniel." Hearing her call his name after so many months broke something inside him. He swallowed hard. "I searched everywhere." She stared silently at him. "I thought." His voice failed. Grace noticed the wedding ring on his finger. Then she looked at Vanessa standing several steps away. Realization slowly settled over her. "You got married." Daniel quickly shook his head. "No. The ceremony." He couldn't explain. "Not now. Not here." Grace forced herself to stand. "I should go." Daniel immediately caught her wrist. "No." She gently tried to pull away. "Please. I have work. I've already lost you once. I'm not losing you again." Grace looked at him with pain-filled eyes. "You already did." Those words struck Daniel harder than any blow. Vanessa slowly walked toward them. The ballroom became so quiet that every footstep echoed. She looked at Grace, then at Daniel. Finally, she asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Daniel, who is she?" Daniel turned toward Vanessa. His voice was barely above a whisper. "My wife." The entire ballroom gasped. Silence swallowed the celebration. Champagne glasses froze halfway to people's lips. Conversations stopped instantly. Photographers lowered their cameras in confusion. Vanessa stared at Daniel, then at Grace, then back again. "You said." Daniel closed his eyes. "I believed she had left me." Grace's tears flowed freely. "I never left." Daniel looked at her sharply. "What?" She shook her head slowly. "I never left you." The words hit him like lightning. His heartbeat quickened. "What do you mean?" Grace looked around at the hundreds of curious faces watching them. "I can't do this here." Daniel took one step closer. "No. We're talking. Now." She looked down. "I've spent months waiting for you. I can wait 5 more minutes." Daniel gently reached for her hand. His voice softened. "Please, tell me the truth." Grace looked into the eyes of the man she had never stopped loving. The same eyes she had dreamed about every night. The same eyes that once promised to come back for her. She knew that once she spoke, nothing would ever be the same again. And somewhere far away, completely unaware, the people who had built their lives upon betrayal were about to watch everything they had hidden come crashing down. The grand ballroom remained silent. Hundreds of guests stood frozen, their eyes fixed on Daniel and Grace. Only moments earlier, the room had been filled with laughter, music, and celebration. Now, confusion had replaced joy. The orchestra had stopped playing. Even the waiters stood motionless, unsure whether to continue serving food or disappear quietly. Daniel still held Grace's trembling hand. He was afraid that if he let go, she would vanish again. He searched her face desperately. "So you didn't leave me?" Grace slowly shook her head. "No. You didn't marry another man?" Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. "No." Daniel felt his knees weaken. His heartbeat thundered inside his chest. Everything his family had told him, every painful word, every sleepless night, every moment he had forced himself to believe Grace had abandoned him. Could it all have been a lie? He swallowed hard. "Please, tell me everything." Grace looked around the crowded ballroom. Every guest was watching. Television cameras were still recording. Business leaders whispered among themselves. This was not the place. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Not here." Daniel looked toward the hotel manager. "I need a private room." Immediately, the manager nodded quickly. "Right this way, sir." Daniel turned to Vanessa. His eyes were full of regret. "I'm sorry. I have to know the truth." Vanessa looked at Grace, then back at Daniel. She could see the pain in both of their eyes. She nodded gently. "Go. I'll handle the guests." Daniel whispered, "Thank you." Without another word, he walked beside Grace toward one of the hotel's private conference rooms. Michael quietly followed. So did Vanessa. She wasn't there to interrupt. She simply wanted to understand. The heavy door closed behind them, shutting out the noise of the ballroom. For several moments, no one spoke. Grace stood near the window, her hands tightly clasped together. Daniel remained a few feet away, unable to take his eyes off her. She looked different. Life had clearly been difficult. There was exhaustion written across her face. Yet she was still the woman he had loved from the very beginning. His wife. Finally, he spoke. "When I came home, my parents told me you left." Grace looked up slowly. "I know. They said you found another man." She closed her eyes. "They lied." Daniel's voice cracked. "They said you told them you deserved a better life." "I never said that. They told me you changed your phone number." "My phone broke months after they threw me out." Daniel stared at her. "They threw you out?" Grace nodded. Daniel's face went pale. "What do you mean? They threw you out?" Her voice trembled. "The day they accused me of stealing money." Daniel frowned. "What money?" Grace took a slow breath. "Money you sent." Daniel felt the room spinning. "I sent that money for you." "I know. They kept it. And then they accused me of stealing it." Daniel could hardly breathe. "No." Grace continued quietly. "They searched my room. They shouted at me. Your brothers carried my suitcase outside. I begged them. I reminded them I was pregnant. They didn't care." Daniel's hands began shaking uncontrollably. "They pushed me out. I had nowhere to go." Silence filled the room. Michael lowered his head. Vanessa covered her mouth. Neither of them had expected anything so cruel. Daniel slowly stepped backward until he reached a chair. He collapsed into it. His mind refused to accept what he had just heard. "My mother. My father. My brothers." Grace nodded sadly. "I kept waiting for you. I thought maybe you'd call. I did. So many times. My phone stopped working. I couldn't afford another one." Daniel looked up sharply. "I searched everywhere. I went to our apartment, our church, your tailor shop. I hired investigators. I couldn't find you." Grace smiled through tears. "I wasn't hiding. I was surviving." The words pierced Daniel's heart. "What happened after they threw you out?" Grace looked down at her hands. "My friend Sarah found me. She took me into her one-room apartment. I started washing dishes, cleaning houses, washing clothes, anything I could find." Daniel closed his eyes tightly. He pictured Grace, his pregnant wife, doing menial jobs while he believed she had abandoned him. His chest tightened with unbearable guilt. "I failed you." Grace immediately shook her head. "No, you didn't know. I should have known." You trusted your family. So did I. Daniel slowly stood again. His voice barely came out. Our baby. Grace instinctively smiled. He is beautiful. Daniel froze. He. She nodded. A boy. His eyes widened. We have a son? Grace smiled through her tears. Yes. Daniel covered his mouth. For nearly a year, he had believed he had lost everything. Now, within minutes, he had discovered not only that his wife had remained faithful, but that he was already a father. His voice trembled. Where is he? With Sarah. She stayed home to watch him while I worked. Daniel could no longer control his emotions. Tears streamed freely down his face. I missed everything. His birth. His first smile. His first cry. Grace's own tears returned. I wished you were there. Every single day. Daniel slowly walked toward her. I'm so sorry. Grace shook her head gently. You don't have to apologize. I believed a lie. You were deceived. I still should have protected you. Grace looked into his eyes. You came looking for me. I know you did. That matters. Vanessa quietly stepped forward. Her voice was soft. May I ask something? Grace nodded. When you saw Daniel today, what did you think? Grace smiled sadly. I thought he had forgotten me. I thought he'd found someone better. Vanessa lowered her eyes. I never wanted to replace you. Grace looked surprised. I didn't know. Vanessa smiled faintly. Neither did I. She turned toward Daniel. Now I understand why your heart was never completely here. Daniel looked at her with guilt. I'm sorry. She raised her hand gently. You don't owe me an apology. You believed your wife had left. You tried to move forward. She looked at Grace again. But she never stopped loving you. Grace quietly nodded. Never. Vanessa smiled through tears. Neither did you. Daniel remained silent. He couldn't deny it. He had never stopped loving Grace. Not for a single day. A gentle knock interrupted the room. Michael opened the door. The hotel manager stood outside nervously. Sir. The guests are asking questions. The media is waiting. Daniel nodded. I'll come. He turned back toward Grace. Will you wait here? She hesitated. I don't belong here. You belong beside me. Grace looked down. I'm just a waitress. Daniel immediately stepped closer. No. You're my wife. The conviction in his voice made everyone in the room fall silent. For the first time that day, Grace allowed herself to believe those words. Daniel walked back into the ballroom. The room instantly fell silent. Hundreds of faces turned toward him. Television cameras pointed in his direction. Vanessa quietly stood beside him. Michael remained a few steps behind. Daniel took a deep breath. Ladies and gentlemen, I owe everyone an explanation. No one moved. My wife. He paused. My legal wife. The whispers grew louder. Is alive. Gasps echoed across the ballroom. I was made to believe she abandoned me. I discovered today that everything I was told was false. He looked toward the conference room door. My wife was forced out of my family home while pregnant with our child. She has suffered for months because of lies. The room became completely silent again. Daniel continued. I cannot continue with this wedding. He turned toward Vanessa. I deeply apologize. You deserve honesty. You deserve someone whose whole heart belongs to you. Vanessa smiled sadly. It already does. She looked toward Grace. It just never belonged to me. With surprising grace and dignity, she reached for the microphone. I would rather lose a wedding than become the reason a family remains separated. Many guests applauded softly. Several women wiped tears from their eyes. Vanessa walked toward Grace, who had just entered the ballroom hesitantly. Everyone stared. Vanessa smiled warmly. You've been through enough. She gently took Grace's hand. Take your husband home. Grace burst into tears. Vanessa embraced her. I truly hope you're both happy. The ballroom erupted into emotional applause. Outside the hotel, journalists rushed toward the entrance. News of the canceled billionaire wedding spread across social media within minutes. Television stations interrupted their regular programming. Headlines flashed across screens. Billionaire calls off wedding after finding first wife alive. Shocking family betrayal exposed. Waitress revealed as billionaire's legal wife. But Daniel paid no attention to the cameras. He gently held Grace's hand as they walked toward his car. Before opening the door for her, he stopped. He looked into her eyes. "There is one more thing." Grace waited quietly. Daniel slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Guests, reporters, and hotel staff watched in stunned silence. He reached into his pocket. Inside was the small velvet box containing the diamond ring he had bought nearly a year earlier to replace the jewelry Grace had sacrificed for him. He opened it. "I bought this because you sold your mother's jewelry so I could chase my dream." His voice broke. "I was supposed to give it to you the day I found you." Tears streamed down Grace's face. Daniel looked up at her. "I know we are already married, but after everything we've been through, I want to ask again." He took a shaky breath. "Grace, will you allow me the privilege of spending the rest of my life making up for every moment we lost?" Unable to speak, Grace nodded through her tears. Daniel slipped the sparkling ring onto her finger. Then he stood and wrapped her tightly in his arms. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, husband and wife held each other without fear. Neither of them realized that an even more difficult confrontation still lay ahead. Because before they could begin their new life together, Daniel intended to face the people who had destroyed their family. And this time, the truth would come with consequences. The morning after the canceled wedding, every major newspaper carried the same headline. "Billionaire abandons wedding after discovering wife was lied about." Television stations replayed the dramatic footage over and over again. Social media exploded with debates. Some praised Daniel for choosing truth over public opinion. Others questioned how an entire family could deceive someone for so long. None of that mattered to Daniel. He had only one goal: to uncover every detail of what had happened while he was away. Grace woke early in one of the luxury suites Daniel had reserved at the hotel. For the first time in many months, she had slept on a comfortable bed. Yet sleep had brought little peace. Too much had happened in a single day. She sat quietly near the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky with shades of orange and gold. A gentle knock came at the door. "Come in." Daniel stepped inside carrying a breakfast tray. Fresh fruit, toast, tea, and a small bouquet of white lilies. Grace smiled softly. "You didn't have to do all this." Daniel placed the tray on the table. "I should have done it a long time ago." He sat across from her. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I barely slept." Grace looked at him. "Neither did I." He sighed deeply. "I keep replaying everything in my head. The signs were there. I just didn't see them." Grace reached across the table and gently held his hand. "You trusted your family. I don't regret trusting them. I regret not asking more questions." His voice trembled. "I should have searched harder." Grace squeezed his hand. "You searched. You came back. You hired investigators. You never stopped looking." Daniel looked into her eyes. "But I stopped believing." Fresh tears gathered in Grace's eyes. "We're here now." He nodded. "Yes, we're here." A soft knock interrupted them. Michael entered the room. "Sorry to interrupt. I have news." Daniel looked up. "What is it?" "The media is camped outside the hotel. They're asking for interviews." Daniel shook his head. "No interviews. Not now." Michael nodded. "There is something else." He handed Daniel a folder. "I hired a private investigator after last night." Daniel looked surprised. "You did? I thought you'd want facts." Daniel opened the folder. Inside were photographs, witness statements, hospital records, employment records, rental agreements. Everything documented Grace's life over the past year. Each page made Daniel's heart heavier. Hospital visits during pregnancy. Employment records from Madame Rose's restaurant. Rent receipts signed by Sarah. medical bills, even photographs showing Grace working while heavily pregnant. Daniel stared silently at the documents. Every page confirmed Grace's story. Not one detail had been exaggerated. Everything was true. Michael quietly spoke. "There's more." He handed Daniel another document. The investigator interviewed neighbors. Daniel continued reading. Several neighbors confirmed seeing Grace thrown out of his parents' house. One elderly woman even described hearing Grace beg while holding her stomach. Daniel closed the file. His hands trembled. "They really did it." Michael nodded sadly. "Yes." Meanwhile, Sarah arrived at the hotel carrying baby David in her arms. She had hardly slept after hearing the astonishing news. Grace rushed toward her. "Sarah!" The two friends embraced tightly. Then Sarah carefully placed the baby into Grace's arms. "Someone has been looking for his mother all morning." Grace smiled lovingly. "My little prince." Daniel stood frozen. His eyes locked on the tiny baby. The little boy looked curiously around the room before smiling. Exactly the same smile Daniel had seen in the mirror every day of his life. Daniel whispered, "My son." Grace turned toward him. She slowly walked closer. "Meet David." Daniel's hands shook. "I've never even held him." Grace smiled gently. "You can." Carefully, she placed the baby into Daniel's arms. Daniel held him awkwardly at first. Then naturally, David looked up at him. For several seconds, they simply stared at each other. Then the baby reached out and wrapped his tiny fingers around Daniel's thumb. Daniel completely broke down. Tears streamed freely down his face. "I missed your first smile," he whispered to the baby. "I missed your first cry. I'm sorry." David laughed softly, unaware of the pain behind his father's tears. Grace quietly wiped away her own tears. The sight healed something inside her. For months she had imagined this exact moment. Now it was finally real. Later that afternoon, Daniel looked toward Michael. "Prepare the car." Michael nodded. "We're going to your parents' house?" "Yes." Grace immediately became nervous. "You don't have to." Daniel looked at her. "I do." They have to answer. An hour later, 3 black SUVs stopped outside Daniel's parents' compound. Neighbors immediately gathered outside their homes. Word had already spread about the canceled wedding. Beatrice stepped onto the veranda. Her confident smile disappeared the moment she saw Grace stepping out of the vehicle holding baby David. Daniel walked ahead of everyone. His face remained calm, almost too calm. That frightened Beatrice more than shouting would have. "My son." Daniel raised his hand. "Don't." The single word silenced everyone. Samuel slowly walked outside. Vivian followed. Daniel looked at each of them. "I asked one question the day I came home. Where is Grace?" Nobody answered. "I asked again. What happened?" Still silence. Daniel slowly held up the investigation file. "I know everything." Beatrice swallowed nervously. "My son. You lied." "No. You lied." His voice echoed across the compound. Neighbors quietly watched from outside the gate. Daniel looked directly at his mother. "You accused my pregnant wife of stealing." "I never." "You threw her onto the street." "You took the money I sent for her." Beatrice's face lost all color. Daniel continued. "You watched her suffer. You let me believe she abandoned me." His voice shook with anger. "You looked into my eyes and lied." Samuel lowered his head. "We made mistakes." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Mistakes? A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. A mistake is taking the wrong road. What you did destroyed my family." Vivian finally spoke. "We only wanted what was best for you." Daniel looked at her in disbelief. "You wanted me to marry someone rich." She remained silent. "You hated Grace because she came from a poor family." No one denied it. That silence became their confession. Grace quietly stood beside Sarah. She held David close. Beatrice suddenly turned toward Grace. "You've poisoned my son's mind." Grace looked shocked. "I haven't said anything except the truth." "Liar." Daniel stepped between them immediately. "Enough." His voice was colder than any of them had ever heard. "You will never raise your voice at my wife again." Beatrice stared at him. "She's turning you against your family." Daniel slowly shook his head. "No. You did that yourselves." Just then another vehicle stopped outside the compound. Michael stepped out. Behind him came Madame Rose, Sarah, the elderly neighbor who had witnessed Grace being thrown out, the local clinic doctor, and two other neighbors. Daniel looked toward them. "Thank you for coming." One by one, each person described what they had seen. The elderly neighbor spoke first. "I watched Grace beg your sons not to throw her out." The doctor added, "I repeatedly warned that she needed rest." Madame Rose spoke next. "She washed dishes while pregnant because she had nowhere else to go." Sarah looked directly at Daniel's family. "I found her crying in a park. She hadn't eaten." The compound became painfully quiet. There was no longer any room for lies. The truth stood before everyone. Daniel slowly removed a folder from his briefcase. He handed it to his father. Samuel opened it. His eyes widened. "What is this?" "Legal documents." Beatrice frowned. Daniel spoke calmly. "Every property I purchased in Nigeria that was registered in your names, I've transferred back. Every bank account receiving my financial support has been closed." Samuel looked up. "My son," Daniel continued, "the monthly allowance ends today." Vivian gasped. "You can't do that." "I already have." Beatrice stepped forward desperately. "Daniel." He looked at her. "I gave you money to care for my wife. You stole it. I trusted you. You betrayed that trust." His voice softened. "I'll always honor you as my parents. But I can never trust you again." Tears finally appeared in Beatrice's eyes. She looked at Grace, then at baby David. Only now did she truly realize what she had lost. "My grandson." She reached toward the baby. Grace instinctively stepped back. Daniel gently placed his hand on Grace's shoulder. "No." His mother looked heartbroken. "Please." Daniel slowly shook his head. "My son will never grow up where love depends on money." Silence followed. The words cut deeper than any punishment. Daniel turned toward Grace. "Let's go home." Grace looked surprised. "Home?" He smiled. "Our home." She nodded. As they walked toward the SUV, neighbors quietly stepped aside. Many smiled at Grace. Some apologized for never helping sooner. Others simply wished them well. Grace climbed into the vehicle holding David. Daniel sat beside them. Before the door closed, he looked back one final time. His parents still stood in the compound. Older, smaller, broken. He silently prayed that one day they would truly repent. Not because he wished them suffering, but because real forgiveness could only begin with genuine remorse. As the convoy drove away, Daniel looked at his sleeping son, then at Grace. He gently intertwined his fingers with hers. "I made you a promise at the airport." Grace smiled softly. "You said you'd come back before the baby was born." Daniel nodded sadly. "I failed." Grace squeezed his hand. "You came back." He smiled. "And this time, I'm never letting go again." Grace rested her head against his shoulder. Outside the window, the city slowly disappeared behind them. Ahead lay a new beginning, one free from lies, one built on truth. Within days, Daniel would complete the paperwork to take Grace and little David to America, where a beautiful home, and the future they had dreamed about from the very beginning, was finally waiting for them. 3 weeks after Daniel confronted his family, the atmosphere in their lives had changed completely. For the first time in a long while, Grace no longer woke up frightened. There was no harsh voice ordering her out of bed before sunrise. No endless list of chores waiting for her. No fear of insults or accusations. Instead, she woke each morning to the soft laughter of little David. The 4-month-old had become the center of Daniel's world. Every morning, Daniel insisted on carrying his son around the house before starting work. "I have to make up for lost time," he would say with a smile. Grace often stood quietly by the doorway, watching father and son together. She had imagined this moment countless times during the lonely months she spent working as a waitress. Now it finally felt real. Daniel had postponed every major business commitment. Board meetings were handled through video conferences. International travel was canceled. His only priority was bringing his family together. One afternoon, the dining table in their hotel suite was covered with passports, birth certificates, immigration forms, and legal documents. A senior immigration lawyer arranged the paperwork neatly. "Everything is moving quickly," the lawyer said. "Because of Mr. Okafor's residency status and your marriage records, the process has been expedited." Grace looked at Daniel. "I still can't believe this is happening." Daniel smiled. "I promised I'd take you with me. It just took longer than it should have." Grace reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "What matters is that we're together." The lawyer smiled politely before continuing. "We'll also process David's documents immediately." Daniel looked proudly at his son, who was sleeping peacefully in a stroller nearby. "My little man is getting his first passport." Grace laughed. "He doesn't even know. He'll thank us later." The following week, Daniel took Grace shopping. At first, she refused. "I already have enough clothes." Daniel laughed. "You have 3 dresses. They're still good. They're also worn out. I don't need expensive things." Daniel stopped walking and looked directly into her eyes. "For months, you denied yourself everything so our son could eat. You wore the same uniforms every day. You worked while pregnant. You skipped meals." Grace looked down. "I was only doing what any mother would do." Daniel gently lifted her chin. "Now it's my turn to take care of you." He led her into one of the city's finest boutiques. Grace hesitated at the entrance. The elegant displays, polished floors, and luxury brands reminded her of a world she had never imagined entering. A sales consultant approached them with a warm smile. "Welcome." Daniel pointed toward Grace. "My wife needs a new wardrobe." Grace immediately whispered, "I don't need that many." Daniel smiled. "I wasn't asking." She laughed for the first time in days. Hours later, shopping bags filled the back of their vehicle. Comfortable dresses, shoes, baby clothes, diapers, strollers, blankets, everything Grace had spent months wishing she could afford. As they drove away, she quietly looked out the window. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked. She smiled softly. "A year ago, I couldn't even afford baby formula." Daniel reached for her hand. "You'll never have to worry about that again." A few days before their flight, Daniel surprised Grace with one final stop. He parked outside a modest apartment building. Grace frowned. "Why are we here?" Daniel smiled. "Come with me." They climbed the stairs together. Daniel knocked on one of the doors. A familiar voice answered. "Coming." The door opened. Sarah froze, then screamed, "Grace!" The 2 women embraced tightly. Daniel smiled as he watched them. Sarah looked around. "What are you both doing here?" Daniel handed her a small envelope. "I came to say thank you." Sarah looked confused. "For what?" "For saving my family." She slowly opened the envelope. Inside was the deed to a fully paid 3-bedroom house. Her eyes widened. "No! This can't be." Daniel nodded. "It is." Sarah immediately shook her head. "I can't accept this." "You must. I only helped my friend. You gave my wife and son a home when my own family abandoned them." He continued gently, "No amount of money can repay that." Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "You don't owe me anything." Daniel smiled. "I know. But gratitude shouldn't remain only in words." Grace hugged Sarah once again. "I'll never forget what you did for me." Sarah smiled through tears. "You'd have done the same." "I hope so." Before leaving, Daniel also handed Sarah documents establishing a scholarship fund in her name for struggling single mothers. Sarah covered her mouth in disbelief. "I don't even know what to say." Daniel smiled warmly. "Just keep changing lives." The day of departure finally arrived. The airport looked very different from the last time Grace had stood there. Months earlier, she had watched Daniel disappear through the departure gate while believing they would be reunited within weeks. Instead, life had taken them through heartbreak, betrayal, poverty, and unimaginable pain. Now they stood together. Daniel held David in his arms. Grace stood beside them, smiling through happy tears. "This time," Daniel whispered, "we're leaving together." Grace nodded. "Forever." As they checked in their luggage, Daniel noticed Grace looking around thoughtfully. "What is it?" "I was remembering. The last time we were here." He gently wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We didn't know what was coming." "No. But somehow, we survived." Daniel smiled. "We didn't just survive. We found each other again." The flight to America lasted many hours. For Grace, everything felt new. It was her first time on an airplane. She nervously gripped the armrest during takeoff. Daniel laughed softly. "It's okay. I'm scared." He gently held her hand. "I've got you." She smiled. "So does David." Their son slept peacefully through almost the entire flight, completely unaware that his life was changing forever. Whenever Grace looked out the window at the endless clouds, she remembered all the nights she had cried herself to sleep. Those tears seemed impossibly far away now. When the plane landed, Daniel looked toward Grace. "Welcome home." She blinked. "Home?" He nodded. "Our home." After completing immigration formalities, they stepped outside the airport. A sleek black SUV waited nearby. The driver smiled respectfully. "Welcome back, Mr. Okafor." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." The drive through the city left Grace speechless. Towering buildings stretched into the sky. Wide roads, beautiful parks, clean neighborhoods. Everything looked different from anything she had ever known. David stared curiously through the window, making tiny sounds of excitement. Grace laughed. "I think he likes it already." Daniel smiled. "He hasn't even seen the best part." Nearly an hour later, the SUV turned into a quiet lakeside neighborhood. Large trees lined the streets. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Families walked their dogs in the evening sunshine. The vehicle finally stopped before a beautiful white house with large windows, a flower garden, and a wide front porch. Grace stared silently. Daniel stepped out and opened her door. She slowly climbed out. "Whose house is this?" Daniel smiled. "Ours." She looked at him in disbelief. "Ours?" He nodded. "I bought it while dreaming about bringing you here." Grace covered her mouth. "I thought you'd never see it?" She nodded. "I almost sold it after I believed I'd lost you." He took her hand. "I'm glad I didn't." Inside, the house felt warm rather than extravagant. The living room overlooked the lake. The kitchen was spacious and filled with natural light. Fresh flowers decorated the dining table. Family photographs had already been placed on the walls. Grace noticed one frame immediately. It held their wedding picture. Beside it was a new photograph Daniel had taken the day he first held David. Her eyes filled with tears. "You kept our picture." Daniel looked surprised. "It never left my side." He walked toward the hallway. "I want to show you something." Grace followed. He opened a white door. She froze. The nursery. Everything was exactly as Daniel had described months earlier. The white crib, the rocking chair, the stuffed animals. Tiny clothes neatly arranged inside the wardrobe. Grace slowly walked inside. She gently touched the crib. "You prepared all this?" "Before I even came home to Nigeria." Daniel nodded. "I thought I'd surprise you." His voice softened. "When I believed I'd lost you, I couldn't bring myself to change anything." Grace turned toward him. "You never stopped hoping." "I tried to, but hope refused to leave." She crossed the room and embraced him tightly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. David suddenly giggled from Daniel's arms. Both parents laughed. Grace kissed their son's forehead. "I think someone wants to see his room." Daniel carefully laid David in the crib. The little boy stretched happily before falling asleep almost immediately. Daniel looked at Grace. "I've waited so long to see that." "What?" "My son sleeping in the room his mother helped me dream about." Grace rested her head against his shoulder. So have I. Over the following weeks, life slowly settled into a peaceful routine. Daniel worked from home several days each week so he could spend more time with his family. Every evening, he cooked dinner with Grace. Sometimes they burned the food while laughing together. Other nights, they sat on the back porch watching the sunset over the lake while David slept peacefully in his stroller. Grace enrolled in English communication classes and began taking online courses in fashion design, determined to reopen the tailoring dream she had once abandoned. Daniel supported every idea she shared. "I don't just want you to live comfortably," he told her one evening. "I want you to build the future you've always imagined." Grace smiled. "For the first time in a long time, I believe I can." Daniel wrapped an arm around her. "You can. And whatever dream you choose next, you'll never have to chase it alone again." 6 months passed peacefully in America. For the first time since their marriage, Daniel and Grace experienced the ordinary happiness they had once thought only existed in dreams. Every morning, sunlight streamed through the large windows of their lakeside home, filling every room with warmth. The house that had once felt painfully empty was now alive with laughter. Most of that laughter came from little David. At 10 months old, he had become the happiest child anyone could imagine. He had inherited Daniel's curious eyes and Grace's cheerful smile. He crawled everywhere. Nothing in the house was safe anymore. One morning, Grace walked into the living room carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry. She stopped in the doorway and laughed. David had somehow crawled into Daniel's home office. Paperwork was scattered across the floor. A pen rested triumphantly in his tiny hand. Daniel sat on the carpet instead of his expensive office chair. Rather than stopping the little boy, he was laughing as David proudly waved one of his business reports. "My future CEO has already started reviewing company documents," Daniel joked. Grace shook her head. "That report took you 2 days to prepare. I can always print another copy." He gently picked David up and kissed his forehead. "I'll never get these moments back." Grace smiled. Neither would she. For so long, life had been about survival. Now they finally had the chance to enjoy the little moments they had once taken for granted. Daniel kept his promise. No matter how busy his companies became, he refused to allow work to steal time from his family. He attended every one of David's pediatric appointments. He learned how to change diapers in less than a minute. He insisted on feeding David breakfast whenever he worked from home. Some mornings ended with mashed bananas all over his expensive shirt. Grace would laugh until tears filled her eyes. "You own billion-dollar companies." Daniel shrugged. "And today I lost a battle to baby food." David clapped excitedly as if celebrating his victory. Grace snapped another photograph. She had filled several albums with pictures of father and son. Pictures of memories Daniel had feared he would never have. One Saturday afternoon, Grace stood in the kitchen preparing lunch while Daniel entertained David in the backyard. She watched them through the window. Daniel was teaching their son how to kick a small rubber ball across the grass. David stumbled after it with unsteady little steps before falling onto the soft lawn. Instead of crying, he burst into laughter. Daniel immediately clapped. "That's my boy." Grace smiled to herself. Months earlier, she had stood in a restaurant kitchen washing greasy plates, wondering whether her son would ever know his father. Now she watched them making memories together. God had answered prayers she had almost stopped praying. That evening, after David had fallen asleep, Grace and Daniel sat on the porch overlooking the calm lake. The gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers from the garden. Daniel reached for Grace's hand. "What are you thinking?" She smiled softly. "I was remembering Sarah." Daniel nodded. "So was I. I miss her. We'll visit soon." Grace looked at him. "I wish everyone had a friend like her." Daniel smiled. "She reminded me what real family looks like." Grace squeezed his hand. "She saved me." "No," Daniel corrected gently. "She saved all 3 of us." They sat quietly for a while. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "I've been working on something." Grace looked at him curiously. "What?" "It's a surprise." She laughed. You've never been good at keeping surprises. I know, but I'm trying. The following week, Daniel asked Grace to accompany him downtown. He refused to tell her where they were going. When the car finally stopped, Grace looked through the window. A beautiful two-story building stood before them. Workers were placing the finishing touches on a large sign above the entrance. Grace frowned. "What is this?" Daniel smiled. "Come inside." They walked through the glass doors. The building smelled of fresh paint and new furniture. Several sewing machines stood neatly arranged in one room. Another room displayed colorful fabrics. There was a design studio with large cutting tables. A classroom equipped with computers overlooked the main workshop. Grace looked around in confusion. "What is all this?" Daniel handed her a small envelope. Inside was a certificate of ownership. She read the first line aloud. Grace Designs Fashion Academy. Her hands began trembling. She looked at Daniel. "What is this?" He smiled. "It's yours." She blinked. "Mine?" Daniel nodded. "You once told me your dream was to own a fashion school where women who couldn't afford expensive training could learn for free." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "I only mentioned that once. I never forgot." Tears filled her eyes. "You remembered?" "I remember everything you ever told me." Grace covered her mouth. Daniel continued. "You sacrificed your mother's jewelry so I could build my future. You gave up your dreams so I could chase mine." He gently took both her hands. "Now it's time to build yours." Grace threw her arms around him. She cried openly. Not because of the building. Not because of the expensive equipment. But because someone had finally believed in her dreams as much as she had believed in his. 3 months later, the academy officially opened. Dozens of women attended the first orientation. Some were immigrants. Others were single mothers. Several had escaped abusive homes. A few had never even touched a sewing machine before. Grace welcomed each one personally. "My name is Grace. And this place exists because someone once believed in me when I had almost lost hope." She paused. "I want each of you to leave here believing in yourselves." The room erupted into applause. Daniel watched quietly from the back. His heart swelled with pride. This was the woman he had fallen in love with. Not because she was perfect, but because even after everything she had suffered, she still wanted to lift others instead of seeking revenge. Later that evening, Daniel received an unexpected phone call from Nigeria. The caller ID displayed his father's number. He stared at the screen for several moments. Grace noticed. "You don't have to answer." Daniel hesitated before picking up. "Hello." For a moment, only silence answered. Finally, Samuel spoke. "My son." His voice sounded older than Daniel remembered. "We heard about Grace's school. Congratulations." "Thank you." Another silence followed. Then Samuel sighed. "Your mother has been ill." Daniel frowned. "What happened?" "The doctor says it isn't serious." "But—" He paused. "She cries every day." Daniel closed his eyes. His anger had faded over the months, but the pain remained. Samuel continued quietly. "She wants to apologize." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked through the glass wall into the academy. David sat happily in a high chair while one of the women made funny faces at him. The life he had nearly lost stood right before him. "I need time," Daniel finally said. "I understand." Samuel's voice broke. "We all deserve what happened." "I know." After ending the call, Daniel remained silent. Grace walked over. "What did he say?" He told her everything. She listened quietly. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do you hate them?" Daniel thought carefully before answering. "No, I don't hate them anymore." "What do you feel?" He looked at his wife. "Sad. They destroyed their own family." Grace nodded. "They did." Daniel gently wrapped an arm around her. "I don't know if I'll ever trust them again." "You don't have to. But I don't want to carry bitterness forever." Grace smiled softly. "Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. It means refusing to let yesterday control tomorrow." Daniel looked at her with admiration. "You always know the right thing to say." She laughed. "I've had a lot of time to think." That night, after putting David to bed, Daniel walked into the nursery. His son slept peacefully beneath a soft blanket. Daniel gently adjusted the blanket and whispered, "You'll grow up knowing what love looks like. You'll never have to wonder if your family wants you." He kissed David's forehead before quietly leaving the room. As he entered the hallway, Grace was waiting for him. She slipped her hand into his. "Come on." "Where?" She smiled. "The future is waiting." Together they walked downstairs, leaving behind the painful memories that had once threatened to destroy them. The wounds had not disappeared completely. Some scars never do. But those scars no longer defined their lives. Instead, they became reminders of how far they had come. Together, stronger, wiser, and more deeply in love than ever before. 5 years later, the morning sun shimmered across the calm lake behind the Okafor family home, painting the water with streaks of gold. Inside the house, cheerful laughter echoed from room to room. 5-year-old David raced down the hallway wearing a tiny superhero cape, his little sister, Hope, close behind him. "Wait for me." Hope giggled. "I'm faster," David shouted, laughing as he darted toward the living room. Grace leaned against the kitchen counter, smiling as she watched her children play. She had eventually given birth to Hope 2 years after settling in America, and the little girl had inherited her mother's gentle smile and her father's determined spirit. Daniel walked into the kitchen carrying 2 plates of pancakes shaped like cartoon animals. "I've made breakfast." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You made breakfast?" "I watched 3 cooking videos." She laughed. "And how many pancakes didn't survive?" Daniel pretended to think. "Let's just say the smoke alarm worked perfectly." Grace burst into laughter. "You haven't changed." "I've improved." "Barely." David ran into the kitchen and climbed onto a chair. "Daddy, are these for us?" Daniel placed the plates on the table. "They're made by a world-famous billionaire chef." David looked at the oddly shaped pancakes. "They look funny." Hope poked one with her little finger. "It looks like a dinosaur." Daniel sighed dramatically. "I was aiming for a rabbit." The children laughed so loudly that Grace had to wipe tears from her eyes. Those simple moments had become her greatest treasures. There had been a time when she wondered if her children would ever know such happiness. Now their home overflowed with it. Life had blessed Daniel beyond anything he had once imagined. His technology company had expanded into more than 30 countries. His engineering innovations had transformed transportation and infrastructure projects around the world. Business magazines regularly ranked him among the world's most influential entrepreneurs. Despite the enormous success, he never allowed wealth to define his family. Every evening, regardless of how busy he was, he returned home in time for dinner. Phones were placed aside. Business discussions ended. Family came first. One evening, a reporter interviewing Daniel asked the question many people wanted answered. "You own companies worth billions. What achievement makes you the proudest?" Daniel smiled without hesitation. "My family." The reporter looked surprised. "Not your business empire?" Daniel shook his head. "I almost lost the people who mattered most. I'll never make that mistake again." The interview spread across social media. Millions praised his answer. Grace simply smiled when she watched it. That was the man she had fallen in love with years ago. Success had changed his bank account. It had never changed his heart. Grace's own dreams had flourished. Grace Design's Fashion Academy had become one of the most respected training centers for women seeking new opportunities. Hundreds of women had graduated from the academy. Many had started successful businesses. Some had opened boutiques. Others had become fashion designers whose work appeared on international runways. Every graduation ceremony ended the same way. Grace stood before the students and shared a piece of her story. "There was a time when I believed my life was over. The audience always became quiet. I worked as a waitress. I cleaned houses. I washed dishes while carrying my first child." She looked around the room. If you're sitting here today feeling like your life has no future, please don't give up. Sometimes your greatest breakthrough begins on your darkest day. The room would erupt into applause. But Grace never sought applause. She simply wanted every woman listening to know that difficult seasons did not last forever. Daniel had also established a charitable foundation in Nigeria in honor of Grace's late mother. The foundation provided scholarships for young women from low-income families and financial support for pregnant women abandoned by their relatives. One afternoon, Daniel and Grace visited the foundation during a trip back to Nigeria. They toured classrooms filled with eager students. Grace smiled as one teenage girl approached nervously. "Ma'am, because of your scholarship, I'll be the first doctor in my family." Grace hugged her tightly. "I'm proud of you." Daniel watched quietly. Years earlier, Grace had sacrificed everything so he could chase his dreams. Now, together, they were helping thousands of others chase theirs. That felt like the greatest success of all. During the same visit to Nigeria, Daniel made a decision he had been considering for years. He turned to Grace one evening. "Would you come with me tomorrow?" "Where?" "My parents' house." Grace looked at him thoughtfully. "Are you sure?" "I think it's time." The following afternoon, they drove through the familiar streets Daniel had once traveled with so much excitement before discovering the lies that had torn his life apart. The old family compound looked different now. The paint had faded. The garden was overgrown. Time had left its mark. Daniel knocked gently. After a few moments, the door opened. Samuel stood there. He looked older. His hair had become completely gray. For several seconds, father and son simply looked at one another. Then Samuel's eyes filled with tears. "My son." Daniel nodded respectfully. "Papa." Samuel stepped aside quietly. "Please come in." Inside the living room, Beatrice slowly stood from her chair. She looked frail. The proud, commanding woman Grace had once known had become noticeably weaker. The moment she saw Grace, her eyes overflowed. She slowly walked forward before stopping a few feet away. Without saying a word, she knelt. Grace gasped. "Mama!" Beatrice shook her head. "No, I don't deserve for you to call me that." Her voice trembled. "I have prayed every day for God to forgive me. I don't know if you ever will." Tears streamed freely down her cheeks. "I allowed pride to blind me. I judged you because you were poor. I forgot that character is worth more than money." She looked toward David and Hope, who stood quietly beside Daniel. "I robbed myself of knowing my grandchildren." Grace felt her own eyes fill with tears. Daniel remained silent. He wanted this moment to belong to Grace. Beatrice continued. "I cannot undo what I did. I cannot return the months you suffered. But if there is even a small place in your heart, please forgive me." The room fell silent. Grace slowly walked toward the older woman. Instead of speaking immediately, she gently helped Beatrice stand. Then she embraced her. Both women cried. Grace whispered softly, "I forgave you a long time ago." Beatrice sobbed even harder. "I'm so sorry." "I know." Grace smiled gently. "But don't waste the years you have left living in regret. Spend them loving the family we still have." Daniel finally stepped forward. He embraced his father, then his mother. The pain of the past would never disappear completely. Trust would take time to rebuild. But forgiveness had opened a door that bitterness never could. That evening, the entire family gathered for dinner. For the first time in many years, genuine laughter returned to the old house. David happily told stories about school. Hope proudly showed everyone the picture she had drawn for her grandparents. Beatrice wiped away tears as she admired it. Samuel smiled more than he had in years. Grace quietly watched the scene. She remembered standing outside this very house with a suitcase in one hand and her unborn child growing inside her. She remembered feeling completely alone. If someone had told her then that she would one day return with a loving husband, 2 beautiful children, peace in her heart, and a life beyond her imagination, she would never have believed it. Yet here she was. God had rewritten her story. Several weeks later, back in America, Daniel surprised Grace with one final gift. He invited her to the backyard at sunset. The children played nearby while birds flew across the glowing sky. A small wooden bench overlooked the lake. Daniel took Grace's hands. "Do you remember the little apartment where we started?" Grace smiled. Every detail. The broken sofa. The noisy sewing machine. The flower pot you insisted would bloom. Grace laughed. "It finally did." Daniel nodded. "So did we." He reached into his pocket and removed a small velvet box. Grace looked at him in surprise. "Another ring?" He chuckled. "No." Inside the box was a tiny gold key. "What does this open?" Daniel pointed toward the lake. Across the water stood a newly completed building with elegant glass walls. A sign on the front read, "The Grace and Daniel Family Hope Center." Grace covered her mouth. "What is it?" "A place where abandoned mothers, children, and struggling families can find shelter, counseling, job training, childcare, and a fresh start." Her eyes filled with tears. "You named it after us?" Daniel smiled. "No, I named it after the life we almost lost." He gently placed the key in her hand. "This isn't my dream. It's ours." Grace hugged him tightly. "I love you. I loved you when we had nothing." Daniel kissed her forehead. "And I'll love you for everything we have." As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the lake, David and Hope ran toward their parents. "Daddy! Mommy!" The children wrapped themselves around Daniel and Grace in a joyful embrace. Daniel looked at his wife. "There was a time I thought I had lost everything." Grace smiled. "But love found its way back." He nodded. "It always does." Together they watched the sunset, grateful for every storm they had survived. Their story had begun with sacrifice, endured betrayal, and nearly ended in heartbreak. But in the end, love proved stronger than lies. Faith overcame fear. Forgiveness conquered bitterness. And the family that almost fell apart became living proof that no darkness can permanently defeat hearts that refuse to stop believing in one another. For Daniel and Grace, wealth was never the greatest blessing they received. Their greatest blessing was finding their way back to each other and never letting go again. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to this channel and tell us where you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.